Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in quietly and history, science and the stranger corners of our world are allowed to unfold at an unhurried pace. Tonight's journey begins with a map. Not just any map, but one of those old and troublesome maps that seems to stare back at you the longer you stare at it, as if it knows you're expecting coastlines to behave themselves and islands to stay where they are told. This one does not seem especially interested in either of those things. It is known as the Zeno Map, first published in Venice in 1558 by Niccolo Zeno the Younger, who claimed it preserved the voyages and geographic knowledge of his 14th century ancestors. That is part of what gives it its peculiar pull. It is both younger and older than it first appears, a printed artefact from the 16th century that was presented as a window into a world roughly 2 centuries earlier. Before we wander too far into northern seas and troublesome islands, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what sort of hour has found you. Is it late where you are? With the room gone still except for the hum of something electrical in the corner? Is it early, with the day not quite assembled yet? Perhaps you are somewhere rainy, somewhere dry, somewhere coastal, somewhere far inland, somewhere with a map folded in a drawer that still has coffee stains from a trip you meant to remember properly. There is something fitting, I think, about asking that at the beginning of a story like this, because maps are really questions disguised as answers. They pretend to tell us where things are, but just beneath that neat little performance they are always asking who drew this. What did they know, what did they guess, and what exactly had vanished before anyone thought to measure it properly. If you find this sort of slow and curious wandering soothing, or if it feels like a pleasant way to let the mind drift while still having something to hold on to, I'd be grateful if you liked the video and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet corner reach other people who enjoy falling asleep somewhere between a historical mystery and a disputed coastline. And with tonight's subject, there is always the risk that the mystery may become just a little too interesting. If that happens, then at the very least you will be awake for one of the better kinds of problems, the kind involving missing islands, old letters, cold seas, and a map that may be preserving truth, error, vanity, rumour, or some inconvenient mixture of all four. So let us ease into it carefully. Imagine an old chart spread open in front of you. The paper is busy with names that seem almost familiar and yet not quite right, like hearing someone hum a tune while missing one note in every phrase. You recognise Iceland, or something close to it. You see Greenland, though its outline does not sit comfortably. You see other places too, names like Frisland, Estotiland, Drogeo, Ikaria, lands that either should not be there or should not be there in that form. The longer you look, the less the map behaves like a reliable guide, and the more it begins to act like a witness with an uncertain memory. It offers details, but not peace. It gestures toward places, but not always toward places we can confirm. And in doing so, it raises one of the most irresistible questions in the history of cartography. What are we supposed to do with a map that seems to know too much in some places and not enough in others? That is really the charm of the Zeno Map, not that it simply contains mistakes. Plenty of old maps contain mistakes, and many of them made those mistakes with enthusiasm. Coastlines wobble, mountains wander, rivers grow where no river should be, and entire kingdoms appear to have been drawn after a long lunch and a somewhat optimistic conversation with a sailor. The Zeno Map is more unsettling than that because it sits in the uncomfortable space between obvious fantasy and plausible memory. Some features seem borrowed from genuine northern geography. Some names appear to echo real places. Some shapes look distorted rather than invented. Then, right in the middle of that uncertain terrain, there stands Frisland, one of cartographic history's most famous phantom islands, positioned south of Iceland and treated for generations as if it were perfectly real. The Library of Congress notes that Frisland never existed, yet the Zeno Map helped persuade later map makers that it did, and the island remained on maps of the North Atlantic well into the 16th and 17th centuries. There is something very human in that. Once a land appears on a respected map, it gains a kind of momentum. It becomes easier to repeat than to challenge. If a careful-looking chart tells you an island is there, and another careful-looking chart agrees, and a reputable cartographer copies both, then before long the island acquires the dignity of repetition. It may have no cliffs, no birds, no grass, no sheep, no shoreline touched by any confirmed boot. But on paper, it has inheritance, and in the cartographic world that can be enough to survive for generations. That is one of the reasons the Zeno Map matters, even if it is largely false. It did not merely entertain. It shaped the geography people believed they were sailing through. According to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography and Older Polar Histories, its fictitious names and islands were accepted by prominent cartographers, including Mercator and Ortelius, and even misled explorers such as Martin Frobisher. Already, perhaps, you can feel the story opening wider than a simple question of authenticity. Because the mystery is not only whether the map was genuine, it is also why it was persuasive, why it lasted, and why it still catches the imagination now. We tend to assume that a map is either right or wrong, useful or useless, reality or nonsense. But the older you go, the less tidy that distinction becomes. Early maps often carried accumulated fragments. A sailor's description from one voyage, a copied coastline from an older chart, a garbled place name filtered through 3 languages and a tired scribe, a rumour elevated by repetition, a guess made to close an awkward gap in the page, a national boast dressed up as discovery, a memory sharpened in one corner and blurred in another. In that sense, a map can preserve falsehood without being entirely false, and preserve truth without understanding it. It can be wrong in outline and right in impulse. It can point toward a real region while badly mangling what that region looks like. That possibility is one of the reasons people keep returning to the Zeno Map, rather than simply tossing it into the crowded cupboard, marked hoaxes, and getting on with their afternoon. The official story attached to the map is itself wonderfully suspicious. Niccolo Zeno the Younger said he found old letters and a map in his family archive, damaged from age, and published them in 1558 as evidence of voyages made by 2 of his ancestors, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, in the far North Atlantic during the 1390s. The letters describe shipwreck, strange islands, a ruler named Zichmni, and a sequence of travels through icy waters and remote lands. On paper, it is a marvellous tale, exactly the sort of tale that asks to be repeated around dinner tables by people who appreciate a mixture of family glory and geographical drama. The trouble is that historians have long found deep problems with it. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography states bluntly that the narrative is a crude fabrication, and notes that records place Niccolo Zeno in Venetian public service during years when he was supposedly roaming the North Atlantic. Modern scholarship generally treats the affair as at least heavily manipulated and often outright forged. Now, that sounds rather damning, and in many ways it is. But even a likely fabrication can contain inherited material, and that is where the whole business becomes less neat. Scholars have argued that the printed map drew heavily on earlier cartographic sources, especially Olaus Magnus's 1537 map of the northern regions, and 15th century northern mapping associated with Claudius Clavus. That would help explain why some of the geography feels oddly convincing, while other parts drift into fantasy. It may not be a straightforward invention from a single imaginative afternoon. It may instead be a patchwork, assembled from real northern cartographic traditions, family myth-making, contemporary political pride, and whatever scraps of older material the younger Zeno found useful or irresistible. In other words, the map might be false in the way many enduring stories are false, not because they are made from nothing, but because they are made from too many things stitched together without enough honesty at the seams. And this is where the title of tonight's subject begins to earn its keep. Lands that do not exist anymore can mean more than one thing. It can mean places that never existed at all, like a phantom island accidentally promoted to the rank of geography. It can mean real places that change shape beyond easy recognition. It can mean coastlines altered by shifting ice, sea level, storms, or centuries of erosion. It can mean settlements abandoned and names forgotten. It can mean old regional labels attached to the wrong landmass by later copyists. It can even mean geographic knowledge that was once fragmentary, but later misread so badly that the original referent disappeared under the error. A place may vanish physically. It may vanish linguistically. It may vanish beneath a newer map. History is generous in the ways it lets a place go missing. The Northern Atlantic is a particularly good stage for this sort of confusion. It is not a politely arranged sea. It is a world of cloud, fog, floating ice, deceptive distances, jagged coasts, seasonal hazards, and names passed around by people who did not always share a language, a ruler, or a mapmaker. Sail west or north in the medieval and early modern imagination and certainty starts to fray very quickly. It is hardly surprising that sailors, monks, traders, adventurers, and later armchair scholars produced a geography full of overlap between what was seen, what was heard, and what was inferred. In such a setting, a map like this does not feel impossible. It feels almost inevitable. The remarkable thing is not that somebody made one. The remarkable thing is how long people trusted it. That trust tells us something important about the age that received the map. The 16th century was full of rivalry over discovery, prestige, and priority. To claim that your people, your city, your ancestors had reached important lands first was not just a fun family anecdote. It was a statement about status. Atlas Obscura notes that the Zeno publication elevated both the Zeno family and Venice at a time when older maritime powers were being overshadowed by rising Atlantic empires. A map could therefore be more than a navigational tool. It could be a patriotic argument in decorative form. It could say, very politely and with plenty of place names, that history had perhaps remembered the wrong heroes. Still, even if family pride had a hand in it, the map's staying power came from more than vanity. It also brushed up against real mysteries. Greenland was imperfectly known. Icelandic and Norse traditions preserved memories of farther western lands. Arctic and subarctic coastlines were difficult to chart. Ice cover varied. Reports circulated unevenly. A map that seemed to pull these fragments into one frame could feel like revelation rather than fraud. And because later readers often prefer a dramatic explanation, the Zeno Map has repeatedly been invited back into debates about pre-Columbian contact, lost voyages, secret knowledge, and coastlines that may have looked different before modern conditions fixed them in our minds. Some defenders over the centuries have even argued that features once dismissed as absurd may encode garbled recollections of real places in Greenland, the Faroes, Labrador, or beyond. Most mainstream historians remain unconvinced, but the persistence of the argument is part of the map's afterlife, and perhaps that is why people find it so difficult to leave the Zeno Map alone. It offers the pleasures of mystery and layers. On the surface, there is the straightforward detective story. Did the younger Zeno forge it? Beneath that is the geographical puzzle. Which places, if any, hide beneath these names and outlines? Beneath that is a more unsettling thought. How much of the world can be lost not by sinking beneath the sea, but by being mislabelled, misplaced, or copied badly enough that future generations no longer recognise it? We tend to imagine lost lands as dramatic things, swallowed whole by ocean or lava, Atlantis with better publicity. But many places vanish more quietly. A fishing station is abandoned, a Norse settlement empties, a shoreline shifts, a language recedes, a mapmaker copies a place name one column too far to the left. A phantom is born and the real place, now hidden behind the error, becomes harder to find. So tonight, as we begin this longer exploration, we are not setting out to prove that the Zeno Map contains magical forbidden knowledge, nor to dismiss it with one brisk wave and move on. That would be too tidy for a document this untidy. Instead, we are going to sit with the discomfort it creates. We are going to ask what early mapmakers knew, what they borrowed, what they distorted, and why certain mistakes became stubborn enough to reshape real exploration. We are going to look at phantom islands and shifting coasts, at Greenland and ice, at sea level and rumour, at family ambition, and the strange authority of old paper. We are going to ask whether some of these impossible-looking lands were always impossible, or whether a few of them may preserve fragments of landscapes, coastlines, or travel knowledge that later centuries no longer understood correctly. Because that is the deepest intrigue here, not simply whether the map lies, but whether it lies in the manner of a dream, assembling recognisable parts into a distorted whole, or in the manner of memory, preserving something real while getting the shape badly wrong. And when an old chart begins to blur those lines, it stops being just a curiosity in the history of cartography. It becomes a reminder that the world people inhabited centuries ago was not only physically different in places, but epistemically different too. Their North Atlantic was full of edges we have since filled in, and also full of edges they may have known in ways we have forgotten. Somewhere between those two possibilities, the Zeno Map keeps waiting, with its awkward islands and uncertain confidence, for someone to decide whether it should be filed under error, evidence, or that larger and far more interesting category where human beings usually keep the past when it refuses to behave. If the map itself is the object spread across the table, then the story attached to it is the pair of hands hovering just above it, insisting that what you're looking at is older than it seems, truer than it looks, and stranger than any ordinary family document has a right to be. That story begins, or at least claims to begin, with two Venetian brothers, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, who are said to have sailed into the North Atlantic in the late 14th century and encountered islands, rulers, storms, and distant lands that should have placed them in one of the most intriguing exploration narratives of the medieval world. It is a marvellous tale, which is exactly part of the problem. Marvellous tales are not always false, of course, but they do have a way of arriving with their boots a little too polished and their timing a little too convenient. The version most people encounter was not written by the brothers themselves in the form we have it now. It was published in Venice in 1558 by a descendant, Niccolo Zeno the Younger, who claimed he had discovered old family letters and an ancient map preserved in the Zeno household. According to his account, these papers had been neglected, damaged, and in part destroyed during childhood mischief, which is one of those details that manages to be either disarmingly human or exceptionally useful, depending on how suspicious you happen to be feeling. There is something almost theatrical about it. The precious original map regrettably harmed. The documents, fragmentary, the family archive, suddenly yielding evidence of forgotten greatness just when such evidence would have been particularly flattering. It has all the ingredients of a story that wants to be believed before it has fully earned the right, and yet one can see why it persuaded people. Venice in the 16th century was a place that understood prestige very well. Maritime glory was not some side hobby. It was part of civic identity, part of how a republic explained itself to the world and to its own citizens. By the time the younger Niccolo published the letters and the map, the age of Atlantic exploration was well underway. Spain and Portugal were drawing prestige from oceanic discovery, and older powers had their own reasons for reminding everyone that they too had histories of bold navigation. In that setting, a narrative claiming that Venetian nobles had ventured into the far North Atlantic long before Columbus had a certain strategic elegance. It did not merely decorate the family name, it suggested that Venice had been early to waters that later nations were busy turning into legends of their own. The published narrative tells us that Niccolo Zeno, the elder brother, was shipwrecked in northern waters around 1380 while on a voyage, and that he entered the service of a powerful prince or chieftain called Zishmni. Antonio later joined him, and together the brothers were said to participate in a long sequence of northern travels. They visited islands that seem partly recognisable and partly impossible. They describe places with names that do not fit modern geography in any straightforward way. They sailed near Iceland, Greenland, and farther lands to the west. They reported volcanic activity, fishing, monasteries, storms, and the sort of severe northern conditions that make every bad decision feel permanent. The narrative has exactly the right mixture of practical detail and geographical confusion to feel tantalizing. It is not pure fantasy in the style of medieval monsters and gold-roofed kingdoms. It sounds more grounded than that. But it is not grounded enough to sit still under scrutiny. One reason the story became so attractive is that it lands in that difficult middle space where fabrication and distortion can resemble each other at first glance. A complete invention often glows a bit too brightly. It looks eager. It reaches for wonder too quickly. The Zeno narrative, by contrast, is messy in a persuasive way. Some elements sound like garbled versions of real places. Some descriptions align loosely with known North Atlantic environments. Some names appear to echo genuine regions or islands once known under different forms. That sort of imperfection can be oddly convincing. A flawless lie is suspicious. A lie with seawater on its boots and a few wrong turns in the dark can pass for testimony. Still, historians have had excellent reasons to doubt the account for a very long time. The first and most damaging difficulty is documentary. Records place Niccolò Zeno in Venice, serving in public offices during periods when he was supposedly engaged in far northern adventures. That alone does not answer every question, because medieval records can be incomplete, and names can repeat across families, but it strikes the very centre of the published claim. If the elder Niccolò was demonstrably occupied in Venetian civic life, while the letters say he was sailing around unknown northern islands, then the letters, at least in the form published, cannot be accepted at face value. It means either that the documents were altered, that identities were confused, or that the whole affair was arranged with a confidence history has not been inclined to reward. Then there is the matter of timing. The map was printed in 1558, nearly 2 centuries after the events it supposedly records. That gap matters. The longer the distance between an event and its publication, the more room there is for names to drift, stories to swell, prestige to intrude, and old scraps to be stitched together into a new and rather more useful garment. Family memory is not a neutral archive. It is a warm room in which facts and pride sit very close to each other. Even when people are not deliberately lying, inherited stories tend to move in the direction of coherence and honour. They lose embarrassment. They gain significance. They become a little better dressed every generation. What makes the Zeno brothers' tale particularly slippery is that it does not need to be entirely true or entirely false in order to have power. Suppose, for a moment, that the younger Niccolò did find old family materials. Suppose they contained references to northern travel, names half remembered, and a rough chart copied from some earlier source. Suppose also that he embellished them, improved them, or reorganised them until they could serve the dual purpose of family memorial and historical intervention. That kind of partial manipulation would explain a great deal. It would account for the persistent feeling that the narrative contains scraps of real northern knowledge, while also making impossible claims. It would explain why some details feel inherited and others suspiciously arranged. In a sense, this is often how dubious historical documents survive. They are not spun from nothing. They are built from fragments that make the final structure harder to dismiss, even when the architecture is unsound. And the architecture here is very odd indeed. Take the mysterious figure of Zicmni, for example. Scholars have long tried to identify him with a real historical ruler, often Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, though this association is itself controversial and rests on later interpretation rather than anything securely established by the original sources. The temptation to identify Zicmni with a known noble is understandable. Once you have a name that almost fits, and a region that vaguely corresponds, the narrative begins to feel less like fiction, and more like poor spelling under difficult conditions. But that is one of the recurring dangers in this whole business. The farther the story drifts from secure evidence, the more attractive loose resemblance becomes. A half match starts to feel like a confirmation. A garbled echo starts to sound like proof. That pattern repeats across the narrative's geography. Places in the Zeno account have been linked, with varying degrees of confidence and desperation, to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, Shetland, Orkney, parts of Scotland, and even North America. Sometimes the proposed identifications are plausible enough to make you pause. At other times they resemble a host frantically rearranging name cards at a dinner party so that every guest will seem to belong. One island moves here, another is interpreted there, a ruler becomes someone slightly more famous, a voyage route is adjusted until the ship appears to have gone somewhere historically thrilling. Before long, what began as an uncertain map becomes a full theatrical production, with every scholar trying to persuade the scenery to stand in the right place. The reason this went on for so long is not simply that people were gullible, it is that the North Atlantic of the late medieval and early modern imagination really was a region of partial knowledge and uneven reporting. Norse voyages to Greenland and Vinland were genuine historical phenomena, though not widely integrated into southern European geographical understanding in a stable way. Iceland existed, obviously, but its representation in continental geographic traditions was not always reliable. Greenland was known, but imperfectly. Arctic waters were difficult and dangerous. Sailors' reports could be inconsistent. Older names lingered after their reference had changed in meaning. In such conditions, the Zeno story could feed upon existing uncertainty rather than needing to overcome it. There is also the important matter of style. The letters are not written like a fantasy romance. They contain enough practical matter to invite seriousness. There are storms, fortifications, fisheries, and local customs. There is none of the lazy abundance of completely invented Marvel literature, where every distant shore has giants, magnetic mountains, or rivers running with precious stones. That relative restraint gives the narrative an air of credibility, even though the credibility weakens on inspection. It is much easier to trust a liar who knows not to overdo it. A map with one phantom island is more dangerous than a map covered in dragons, because the dragons at least announce themselves as decorative. You can feel the younger Niccolo's confidence in the way the publication frames the family inheritance. He's not timidly suggesting that these old materials might preserve a curious anecdote. He's presenting them as evidence that ought to alter how discovery itself is remembered. That is an ambitious act. It tells us that he believed the documents could survive public attention, or at least survive it long enough to do their work. And perhaps they did. For a considerable time, the Zeno material influenced cartographers and readers who were quite willing to treat it as valuable. Once it entered the wider stream of geographical literature, it gained the authority of circulation. A printed map and narrative can travel much farther than a private doubt. There is something almost irresistible, too, in the image of the brothers themselves. Medieval Venetians in northern seas, a shipwreck, service under a shadowy prince, long voyages among islands of uncertain identity. The whole thing has the shape of an adventure recounted by candlelight to people who know just enough geography to be impressed and not enough to object. It flatters the listener with mystery. It invites scholarly labour. It gives future centuries an excuse to keep asking whether the impossible parts might secretly be misunderstood truths. This is the kind of story that survives not merely because it is believed, but because it is useful to believe. Explorers, national romantics, speculative historians, and lovers of maritime puzzles can all take something from it. That usefulness became especially pronounced in later centuries when people began looking for evidence of pre-Columbian European contact with North America beyond the Norse sagas. The Zeno narrative was repeatedly recruited into those arguments. If the brothers had indeed gone far west or recorded lands beyond Greenland, then perhaps they preserved early knowledge of parts of the North American coast. Even if mainstream scholarship rejected the strongest versions of that claim, the very possibility ensured the story would not quietly settle into obscurity. Once a historical document starts to look as though it might rewrite who got somewhere first, people become remarkably patient with its defects. And yet the defects remain. The names wobble, the chronology strains, the family context is too convenient. The map that accompanies the narrative appears to draw on sources later than the supposed 14th century voyages, which is another serious difficulty. If the printed map includes information or stylistic elements that depend on 15th or 16th century cartographic traditions, then whatever old material may have existed, the published version is not a transparent medieval survival. It is a reworked object, filtered through later knowledge. That does not make it uninteresting. Quite the opposite. It makes it more interesting as evidence of how Renaissance Europe assembled the past to meet its present needs. Because that is the deeper strangeness of the Zeno brothers' story. It is not only a story about where two men may or may not have sailed. It is also a story about how families manufacture continuity, how cities cultivate prestige, and how maps can turn uncertain memory into apparent geography. A voyage account once printed does not remain just a tale. It starts affecting what later readers think was knowable. It changes the field of the possible. It tells cartographers where to look, or what to copy, or what to leave on the page, because removing it would require a confidence they do not quite possess. You can almost imagine the younger Niccolo at work sorting scraps, names, inherited stories, and whatever older charts he could access. Not necessarily cackling over a blatant fraud, which is too simple an image, but perhaps persuading himself that he was restoring something neglected, polishing what age had dimmed, correcting what time had obscured. Many historical manipulations are done under that banner. People do not always think they are inventing. Sometimes they think they are rescuing truth from disorder, and in the process they become more dangerous than ordinary liars because they grant themselves permission to improve the evidence. That possibility makes the brothers harder to treat as either heroes or villains. The original Niccolo and Antonio, whatever they actually did, may have undertaken voyages that later memory greatly expanded. The younger Niccolo may have inherited genuine fragments, and then overworked them into a claim they could not bear. Historians who dismiss the whole affair as fabrication have strong reasons, but even then the story remains revealing. A forgery tells you what its maker wanted history to allow. A distorted map tells you where knowledge was uncertain enough to be bent. A false voyage narrative tells you which waters still carried enough mystery for invention to pass as correction. So when people speak of the strange story of the Zeno brothers, the strangeness is not merely in the alleged route or the impossible islands. It is in the way the story hovers between archive and performance. It comes to us dressed as recovery but behaves like revision. It claims to preserve the past while rearranging it. It offers names that seem just familiar enough to tease the modern reader into identification, then slips away again. It is a family legend wearing the coat of documentary history, and it wears that coat well enough that generations of readers kept inviting it indoors. That is why the brothers matter, even before one tries to pin each island to a modern coordinate. Their story is the doorway through which the map entered the wider world. Without the narrative, the map would be merely odd. With the narrative, it becomes consequential. The letters tell us how to read the image, or at least how the publisher wanted us to read it. They frame the geography as a record of experience, not just compilation. They encourage us to treat every strange coast as something seen, every awkward name as a memory, every discrepancy as the sort of honest distortion that rough travel can produce. Once that framing is in place, doubt has to work much harder, and that perhaps is where the truly enduring charm lies. The Zeno brothers' tale does not only ask whether we believe it, it asks what kind of evidence we find most seductive. A family archive, a damaged original, a forgotten voyage, a prestigious lineage, a map that appears to say more than it should. These are powerful ingredients. They flatter our sense that history's greatest truths are often hiding in neglected corners, waiting for some fortunate descendant to brush away dust and astonish the world. Sometimes that really does happen. More often, what emerges from the dust is messier, with truth and ambition packed into the same box and neither one properly labelled. So the brothers remain before us, not as steady guides, but as uncertain narrators standing at the edge of cold water, asking us to trust that they went farther than the record can prove, saw more than later maps can confirm, and left behind traces that their descendant only partially understood. Whether they were explorers transformed into legend, names borrowed into fiction, or convenient ancestors pressed into service centuries later, their strange story is what set the whole puzzle in motion. And once that puzzle is moving, the next difficulty arrives almost immediately, because even if one sets the brothers themselves aside for a moment, the map still has to be dealt with, and that leads straight into another uncomfortable question. Was it really a chart from the 14th century at all, or something far more recent wearing medieval costume well enough to keep the argument alive? By the time a map claims to have crossed 2 centuries in silence, and arrived in print carrying secrets from the 14th century, it has already placed a great deal of pressure on our goodwill. We are being asked not only to trust the paper in front of us, but to trust the chain of custody behind it, the memory that preserved it, the family that published it, and the claim that what appears in a printed Venetian book from 1558 is really the surviving echo of voyages and observations made around the 1390s. That is a considerable request. It is also the point where the Zeno Map becomes more than a strange artifact and turns into a test of how historical evidence is supposed to behave when the story attached to it is almost a little too perfect. The younger Niccolo Zeno said he had found the map in the family archive alongside old letters by his ancestors, Niccolo and Antonio, and had published them in Venice in 1558. He also said the original materials had been damaged and that some had been torn up in his youth, leaving him to reconstruct what remained. That explanation has been part of the map's aura ever since, because it is either a candid confession of loss or an exceptionally useful excuse for why the evidence is incomplete in exactly the places where one would most like it to be solid. At first glance, there is something seductive about the claim of medieval origin. If the map really did preserve geographical knowledge from the late 14th century, then it would be extraordinary. It would suggest that Venetian-linked navigators had access to northern information well before the better-known 16th century compilations, and perhaps even that they had encountered or recorded lands in the North Atlantic with a precision that later generations did not fully appreciate. That possibility is one reason people were so reluctant to let go of the map. A document like this does not merely promise age, it promises priority. It hints that the accepted sequence of discovery might not be as settled as schoolroom history likes to pretend. And once a historical object begins whispering that perhaps the wrong people have been credited and the wrong dates have been repeated, it becomes very difficult for the imagination to leave it alone. Still, the case for a genuine 14th century chart runs into trouble almost immediately, and not the charming kind of trouble where 1 or 2 place names can be forgiven for wobbling in a rough sea. The larger difficulty is that historians and map scholars have long concluded that the printed Zeno Map was not a faithful survival from the 1390s at all, but a much later construction built from 16th century and late medieval northern cartographic sources. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography states that it has been shown conclusively that the Zeno Map was based on Olaus Magnus's map of the northern regions and on the 15th century northern mapping tradition associated with Claudius Clavus. The Osher Map Library likewise summarises the scholarly view that F.W. Lucas demonstrated in 1898 that the younger Zeno had fabricated the map, copying place names and outlines from Claudius Clavus derived material as used in Olaus Magnus's famous northern map. In other words, the printed chart appears not as a preserved medieval original, but as a Renaissance assemblage wearing a medieval family story as a very flattering coat. That distinction matters. A reconstructed or fabricated map is not the same thing as a copied old original, and yet the difference can be easy to blur when old names and family legends are involved. If Niccolo the Younger drew heavily on already existing cartographic material from the 1530s, and perhaps other intermediate sources, then the printed map cannot be used as transparent evidence of what Venetian sailors knew in the 1390s. At best, it would be a 16th century reinterpretation of various northern traditions, some older than others. At worst, it would be an intentional imposture designed to make the Zeno family appear prophetic, and Venice appear early to discoveries that later generations wanted to claim for others. The Osher Map Library notes exactly that motive, arguing that the map elevated both the Zeno family and Venice in its rivalry with Genoa by suggesting that Venetians, not Columbus, had been first to important Western discoveries. That gives the publication a clear cultural and political usefulness, and useful documents deserve especially close inspection. The suspicion deepens when we consider how the map behaves internally. If it were truly a 14th century chart, we might expect it to reflect the geographical habits and limitations of that time in a fairly consistent way. Instead, what scholars saw was a curious blend. Some of the map's northern features resemble genuine Scandinavian and North Atlantic cartographic traditions. Some names look borrowed. Some coastlines are distorted in ways that suggest copying and reworking rather than direct first-hand observation. And then there are the phantom lands, above all Friesland, which does not exist at all, and yet appears with a confidence that would be admirable if it were not so misleading. The Osher summary notes that the Zeno map was the first to show Friesland, Estland, Drogeo, and Estutiland, and that these phantom islands were accepted by Renaissance readers and copied onto many later maps. A document that introduces several non-existent lands while also depending on later cartographic models does not look much like a pristine medieval witness. It looks more like a map made in a world where compilation, speculation, and strategic storytelling had already become deeply entangled. There is an important subtlety here though, and it is one reason the map remains interesting, even after the strongest claims for authenticity have weakened. A much later invention does not have to be invented from nothing. Early modern map making was full of borrowing. Cartographers reused outlines, translated names across languages, copied earlier errors, inserted rumours, and adjusted spacing to make coastlines fit available knowledge or expectation. So when scholars say the Zeno map drew on Olaus Magnus and Claudius Clavus traditions, that does not mean every feature sprang into existence in 1558 with no past behind it. It means the printed chart belongs to a network of transmission rather than to a single medieval moment. Some of what appears on it may preserve much older geographic confusion. Some may preserve regional naming traditions in warped form. Some may be deliberate additions or embellishments. The real question, therefore, is not simply old or fake, because historical objects are often inconveniently mixed. The better question is how much of the map reflects inherited northern knowledge, and how much reflects 16th century rearrangement. That mixed quality helps explain why the map fooled so many intelligent people for so long. According to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, it was accepted as genuine for more than a century after publication, and its mythical islands and fantastic names entered the work of major cartographers, including Mercator and Ortelius. It even misled navigators such as Martin Frobisher, who seems to have mistaken Greenland's east coast for the Fryland shown on the Zeno map. A document does not achieve that sort of influence merely by being absurd. It has to be plausible enough in its framework, familiar enough in its style, and timely enough in its claims that later experts feel safer copying it than discarding it. The Zeno map did exactly that. It arrived in a Europe hungry for northern knowledge, eager for prestige, and still uncertain enough about the Atlantic margins that an artful mixture of truth and nonsense could pass for revelation. One of the most revealing parts of the younger Niccolò's account is his explanation that he had damaged the originals as a boy, and later tried to recover or reconstruct what was left. This detail is so narratively efficient that it almost makes one admire it against one's will. Why are the documents incomplete? Because they were torn. Why are there irregularities? Because memory had to repair them. Why can the printed map not be checked directly against a pristine ancestral original? Because the ancestral original was regrettably compromised before anyone understood its value. The Osher Map Library quotes this part of the story and notes that he claimed to recreate what he remembered and publish the result. That is not simply a charming domestic anecdote. It is a built-in defence against exacting criticism. It turns uncertainty into pathos. It invites the reader to see the publisher not as a manipulator, but as a remorseful restorer. And perhaps he saw himself that way. Yet from a historian's point of view, it also means the publication announces its own instability. Then there is the matter of chronology. The brothers' supposed voyages belong to the late 14th century, but the publication belongs to the mid-16th. Between those dates lies not only the passage of time, but one of the most dramatic periods in the history of European mapping. By 1558, mapmakers had access to far more printed material, more developed regional traditions, and a much stronger sense of cartography as a tool of argument and reputation. That is why the presence of 16th century influences on the Zeno Map is so destructive to the claim of simple medieval origin. A genuine old chart might be recopied or cleaned up for publication, of course, but when the very structure and content appear indebted to later sources, the burden shifts decisively. The map no longer looks like an old voice speaking through a new printer. It looks like a new voice impersonating an old one, perhaps with borrowed lines. None of this means that every element on the map is therefore worthless. Historical forgeries and embellished compilations can still preserve evidence, though not always the evidence their makers intended. The Zeno Map tells us, at minimum, what kinds of northern geography 16th century readers were prepared to find believable. It shows how phantom islands could become anchored in apparently respectable scholarship. It reveals the prestige of old family archives and the power of print to stabilise uncertainty. It also provides a case study in how errors travel. Once a place name or island enters circulation under the shelter of a compelling narrative, later mapmakers may inherit it without inheriting the doubt that should have accompanied it. In that sense, even a later invention can become historically important, not because it records the world faithfully, but because it changes the world of ideas through which later people try to navigate. And perhaps that is why the debate over the map's age has never entirely lost its charge. To decide that it is a much later invention is not simply to solve a puzzle and move on. It is to confront an uncomfortable feature of historical knowledge itself. We like to imagine that old documents acquire authority by age alone, as if time were a polishing cloth that automatically makes paper wise. But age is not a guarantee of honesty, and claims of age are even less so. The Zeno Map reminds us that antiquity can be performed. A Renaissance publisher can summon medieval ancestors, invoke damaged originals, and produce a map whose very roughness feels authentic. The result can mislead generations precisely because it looks as though it has suffered. Wear and uncertainty can function as props. A clean forgery invites skepticism. A battered one invites sympathy. There is also a gentler possibility worth holding in view. Not every misleading historical object begins in cynicism. It is entirely possible that Niccolo the Younger had before him a mixture of real family tradition, incomplete documents, and pre-existing maps, and that he convinced himself he was restoring truth rather than manufacturing it. Human beings are very good at improving evidence until it says what they already suspect it ought to say. A family with noble ancestors, a republic proud of its maritime stature, and a century fascinated by discovery could together produce a powerful atmosphere of conviction. Under those conditions, the line between reconstruction and invention can become alarmingly thin. One does not need a villain with a curled moustache leaning over a drafting table. One only needs a descendant, some fragments, and a strong feeling that history has neglected something important and ought now to be corrected. The scholarly verdict, however, has moved firmly away from taking the map at face value. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography goes so far as to call the whole Zeno affair one of the most preposterous and successful fabrications in the history of exploration. The Osher summary echoes the consensus that Lucas effectively exposed the map as an imposture built on later material. That does not settle every small question, but it settles the large one well enough. the chart we have is not best understood as a surviving 14th century map. It is better understood as a 16th century creation that attached itself to a claim of medieval ancestry in order to borrow authority from the past and redirect prestige in the present. Once we accept that, the mystery changes shape. We stop asking whether this paper gives us an unfiltered glimpse of the 1390s and start asking which borrowed coastlines, garbled names and strategic inventions were chosen to make it seem that it could. That shift is important because it keeps us from throwing the map away too quickly. A false medieval origin does not make the document dull. In some ways, it makes it richer. It becomes evidence of Renaissance cartographic culture, of family ambition, of civic rivalry, and of how knowledge moved through copying. It shows us what sort of northern world could still be imagined in 1558. It shows us that Phantom Islands were not trivial curiosities but serious enough to reshape other maps and voyages. It shows us that once a chart acquires dignity through lineage and print, later generations may let it sit at the table long after it should have been asked some firmer questions. And because the map is filled with names that seem as if they ought to mean something real, the temptation to decode it remains very strong, which brings us to the next discomfort waiting just offshore. Even after we conclude that the printed chart was not really a clean survival from the 14th century, we are still left with the names scattered across it. Some are clearly problematic, some are obviously phantom, some seem to echo real places badly, and some sit in that maddening space where a mistaken label may have done more historical damage than an outright fantasy ever could. Once a map has been unmasked as later and composite, the obvious thing would be to dismiss all its geography equally. But old maps rarely mislead so neatly. Their falsehoods have textures. Some islands are inventions, some are displacements, some are real places wearing the wrong names. And that means the next task is not to ask whether the chart is old, but to ask what, exactly, these impossible-seeming lands were pretending to be. Once the question of the map's age begins to wobble, the next thing that starts to wobble with it is language. That is often how old maps become most unsettling. It is not only that their coastlines look wrong, or that certain islands appear where no island ought to be. It is that the names themselves feel like they belong somewhere, just not quite where they have been placed. They have the strange, half-recognisable quality of a face seen in bad weather, or a word remembered from childhood but pronounced wrong after many years away. On the Zeno Map, names drift across the North Atlantic like bits of wreckage from a conversation we arrived too late to hear properly. Frisland, Estotiland, Drogeo, Ikaria, Estland, Engroneland, Islanda. Some are transparent enough to reassure us for a moment, some are not, and some seem to stand in that especially irritating position where they may be nonsense or may be genuine geography after passing through the sort of historical misunderstanding that leaves everyone equally confident and equally lost. The Library of Congress notes that the translated title of the 1558 publication explicitly lists places such as Freeland, Island, Engroneland, Estotiland, Drogeo, and Icaria, placing these uncertain names at the centre of the whole story rather than at its margins. That matters because names are not just labels on old maps. They are survival tools. A coastline can be distorted and still remain traceable if the name attached to it survives in recognisable form. But if the name shifts, is translated badly, copied poorly, or attached to the wrong shore, the geography can begin to vanish in plain sight. A land does not always disappear because it sinks. Sometimes it disappears because no one can agree what it was called in the first place. That possibility hangs over the Zeno Map constantly. Some of its names look invented, some look displaced, some may preserve regional traditions that later readers no longer understood. And because early modern cartography was full of copying, translation and educated guesswork, a mistaken name could become every bit as durable as a mistaken island. Once it entered print, it gained the right kind of dignity. People who would hesitate to invent a new coastline from nothing might still copy an old place name simply because it was already there, and because removing it would mean making a stronger claim to certainty than they felt entitled to make. Take Estland, for example. At first glance it sounds simple enough, almost disappointingly so. One might assume it refers to Estonia, but on the Zeno Map and in later interpretations it has often been associated instead with the Shetland Islands. That sort of mismatch is exactly the point. In an age when names travelled orally, through manuscripts across languages, and by way of sailors who were not always deeply concerned with spelling consistency, a name could migrate surprisingly far from its modern expectation. The Library of Congress summarises the later uncertainty directly, noting that historians have offered different theories about the authenticity of the Zeno story, and that some believe the brothers had travelled in the North Atlantic, while mistaking Iceland for Frisland and identifying figures like Zishmni with other northern nobles. That is not just disagreement about routes, it is disagreement about what these names were ever supposed to mean. And then there is Groenland, which is easier to live with because it clearly gestures toward Greenland, though even there the comfort is limited. Greenland on the Zeno Map is not a neatly settled object. It appears in a cartographic world where Greenland's shape, extent and relationship to neighbouring lands were all still vulnerable to confusion. Some versions of northern maps in the period allowed Greenland to seem almost attached to other regions, or at least more entangled with them than modern atlases would ever permit. So while in Groenland reassures us by sounding close enough to a place we know, it also reminds us that recognisability is not the same as accuracy. A name may survive while the land beneath it is stretched, shifted, or made to carry far too much. The map can therefore feel alternately familiar and unreliable in the same breath, which is one reason it has remained so difficult to dismiss entirely. Parts of it are near enough to reality to keep the imagination working, but the names that trouble people most are the ones that seem to point westward into lands that either should not have been known in the form described, or perhaps were never known at all. Estotiland is one of the most famous. Over the centuries it has been linked by various writers to Newfoundland or nearby parts of northeastern North America. Old interpreters became especially excited by the possibility that this strange word preserved an early European memory of land across the Atlantic. The problem is that almost every proposed identification requires a certain amount of coaxing. Estotiland does not arrive with papers in order. It arrives with a suggestive shape, a suspiciously interesting location, and a name that seems as though it ought to decode if only one stares hard enough, and perhaps ignores 3 or 4 inconvenient details. The Rare Maps essay on the Zeno tradition notes that later readers repeatedly tried to assign the Zeno Islands to real geography, with some taking Estotiland as Newfoundland and Drogeo as part of North America, even while most scholars viewed the voyage and map as examples of the fancy and folly of early travel literature and cartography. That phrase, fancy and folly, is useful because it captures the temperament of the age without making the mistake of thinking everyone was simply foolish. Early modern readers were dealing with partial knowledge. They had rumours from sailors, inherited Norse shadows, travel literature of wildly mixed quality, and a North Atlantic that was far from neatly charted. Under those conditions, a place name like Estotiland did not have to be fully convincing to survive. It only had to seem more plausible than a blank space. Maps dislike emptiness. Human beings dislike it too. An uncertain island with a name is often more satisfying than a large white area, accompanied by a modest note saying, "We do not know." If one had to choose between silence and a word that might preserve some fragment of truth, many cartographers chose the word, and once they did, the word developed a life of its own. Drogeo is even more awkward. In the Zeno letters it is associated with stories of dangerous encounters, cannibals and long westward travel, which places it firmly in that old borderland between geography and tale-telling. The Library of Congress summarises Antonio's letter as describing fishermen who had travelled for 25 years and had discovered Estotiland west of Frisland and a place named Drogeo, where they encountered cannibals and wild animals. This is exactly the sort of detail that both attracts and repels historical confidence. On the one hand, it sounds like the kind of exaggerated travel report that early readers expected from remote lands. On the other hand, the association with a named western place means later generations were unwilling to throw it away entirely. If Estotiland and Drogeo preserved garbled echoes of North America, then perhaps the sensational details were simply the usual theatrical smoke around a real ember. If not, then the names were part of a literary geography assembled to make the voyage seem grander than the evidence allowed. The great temptation with names like these is to assume that every mystery must hide a stable original. We want a clean answer. Freeland was really this. Estotiland was really that. Drogeo was merely another term for some coast we now know well. But old maps resist this kind of neat decoding, because they are often composite things. A single name may carry several histories at once. It may come from rumour, attach itself to the wrong place, absorb features from another land, and then be copied by later map makers who no longer know any of that. In such cases, the hunt for the real referent becomes a bit like trying to identify the original owner of a coat that has been patched, relined, borrowed, and altered over 3 generations. There may be an original garment in there somewhere, but it is no longer a simple matter. Icaria offers another fine example of the problem. It appears in the Zeno material as a land encountered westward, with inhabitants who were not enthusiastic about being visited in the manner Antonio and his companions had in mind. Some later interpreters tried to identify it with the coast of Kerry in Ireland. Others treated it as one more phantom. The point is not that one of these must be correct and the others laughable. The point is that once a map enters public circulation with names that are just plausible enough, generations of readers will try very hard to rescue them into reality. They will slide them north, west, or south. They will compress archipelagos into islands and stretch islands into archipelagos. They will argue that a decayed original was miscopied, that a cluster of islands ran together into one, that a language shift explains the spelling, that a scribe dropped a letter, that a printer reversed a line, that a sailor used the local rather than the foreign form, that a place known to one generation had another name in the previous century. Sometimes this kind of labour is genuinely illuminating. Sometimes it is the historical equivalent of trying to persuade a smudged cloud to become a portrait. Freeland, of course, is the most infamous of all these names because here the problem becomes absolute. The Library of Congress states plainly that Freeland never existed, yet it was commonly shown on maps of the North Atlantic during the 16th and 17th centuries because cartographers believed the Zeno Map had made a real discovery. The article goes on to note that the depiction of Friesland varied significantly from one map to another, and that some later mapmakers kept showing it even into the 18th century. That is not a minor naming issue. That is a full cartographic afterlife granted to a place with no actual shoreline. And yet even Friesland illustrates the same naming difficulty, because later scholars still try to identify it with something real, often Iceland, Greenland, or the Faroes seen through distortion or confusion. In other words, even the clearest phantom retained a gravitational pull toward reality. People did not want to believe that such a substantial island had been created from nothing. They preferred to imagine misplacement rather than pure invention. There is something revealing in that preference. A wrong name attached to the wrong land is easier to forgive than a whole island conjured into existence. It lets us preserve faith in the underlying process. We can say the sailor saw something real, the mapmaker heard something real, the printer copied something real, and only the chain between them slipped. That is comforting. It preserves the dignity of historical geography. A phantom island, by contrast, forces us to admit that the map-making process could produce confident falsehoods, and then keep repeating them for generations. The Zeno tradition offers both possibilities at once. Some names seem to be warped versions of real northern places. Others look as though they were inventions or dramatic expansions of rumour. The map therefore becomes a catalogue not merely of locations, but of different species of error. And error is not always accidental. The names on a map can perform. They can create an atmosphere. A chart crowded with named places suggests experience, intelligence, and authority. It implies that someone has been there, or at least that someone serious has heard from someone who has. This is one reason phantom toponyms can be so effective. They do not just fill space, they create confidence. A nameless ocean invites caution. An ocean populated by Frisland, Icaria and Estotiland feels already half domesticated, as though the unknown has been broken into understandable pieces. Even if those pieces are badly arranged, they are still named, and naming is one of the oldest ways human beings pretend to have gained control. That control, however, can turn back into confusion very quickly, once later explorers begin consulting the map. The Old World Auctions essay notes that Martin Frobisher and his chroniclers believed they had confirmed Freyland, comparing what they saw to the Zeno tradition, and finding it very agreeable, when in fact they had mistaken Greenland for fantasy. That is a remarkable moment because it shows how a name on paper can teach the eye what to think it is seeing. If you expect Friesland, then a real coast may obligingly become Friesland for long enough to reinforce the map. The wrong name does not merely describe, it recruits perception. The same dynamic may help explain why the Western names retained their appeal. If one approached northern exploration already carrying a map that suggested lands to the west, with these intriguing titles, then any half-understood report might seem to confirm one of them. Estotiland could absorb one traveller's coast, Drogeo another, Icaria a failed landing elsewhere. The names became containers waiting to be filled, and the less settled the region, the easier it was to pour speculation into them. In that sense, these are not simply islands without names we know. They are names without stable islands, wandering through the record looking for coasts to attach themselves to. That is why reading the Zeno Map is such a peculiar experience. It is not like reading a modern chart where names anchor the land. Here the names often drift more than the coastlines. They are clues, but unruly ones. Some preserve hints of Iceland, Greenland or Shetland. Some were taken by later readers as shadows of Newfoundland or Labrador. Some are almost certainly phantoms. Yet all of them remind us that the history of mapping is not just a history of where land is, but of how language succeeds or fails at keeping hold of it. When language fails, places do not disappear all at once. They blur, they split. They are copied under altered forms. They become two islands instead of one, or one island instead of several, or a real coast under an unreal title. So before we move deeper into the best known of these names, it helps to pause and notice just how much of this mystery lives in the gap between a word and a world. An old map does not always mislead by drawing the wrong shape. Sometimes it misleads by offering a name that sounds close enough to truth that nobody wants to discard it, even when they can no longer say with confidence what it once referred to. The Zeno Map is full of that kind of half-anchored language, and nowhere is the effect stronger than in the case of Freeland, the phantom island that became so persuasive, so richly detailed, and so durable on paper that for a very long time it managed to behave like a country despite never once having had the decency to exist. If one wanted to choose a single feature on the Zeno Map that best explains why the whole document has survived in conversation for so long, it would probably not be Greenland, or Iceland, or any of the portions that can at least gesture towards something known. It would be Freeland. Freeland is the island that should settle the matter and somehow never quite does. It sits there on the map with a confidence that feels almost rude, large and fully formed in the North Atlantic, placed south of Iceland and rendered with enough shape, settlement names and internal detail to make blank skepticism feel almost impolite. If it were a vague smudge, perhaps no one would care, but it is not vague. It is one of the most elaborately presented places on the chart, and that is exactly why it became so dangerous. The Library of Congress notes that Frisland was commonly shown on maps of the North Atlantic during the 16th and 17th centuries, even though it never existed because cartographers believed the Zeno Map had revealed a real island. That is an astonishing sentence when you stop to think about it. An island that never existed did not merely appear once in a corner of some neglected chart. It settled into the cartographic bloodstream. It became a habit. It entered atlases, influenced other map makers, and lingered long enough to shape how people imagined the Northern Ocean. Once Freeland was granted the dignity of being drawn, named, and copied, it began behaving like a place in the historical record. It acquired, in a paper sense, the basic rights of geography. It could be discussed, compared, adjusted, approached, and mistaken for. It could have coasts and harbours and neighbouring islands. It could sit quietly on maps long enough that removing it later would feel almost like an act of aggression against tradition rather than a simple correction. That is one of the odd powers of cartography. A lie with a coastline can outlive a truth that never found a printer. Freeland arrives in the Zeno story already equipped with narrative support, in the account published by Niccolo Zeno the Younger, the Elder. Niccolo is blown off course in the North Atlantic and wrecked on this island, where he encounters the ruler Zishimni. Antonio later joins him, and Freeland becomes not a passing feature, but a central base of operations, a place from which the brothers move outward into surrounding seas and neighbouring territories. The Ruderman essay on the Zeno tradition summarises the tale in exactly this way. A storm drives Niccolo into the far North Atlantic. He is wrecked on Frislander, he is received by Zichumni, and the brothers' subsequent movements around nearby islands and coasts are framed through this starting point. In other words, Frisland is not just one more name on the map, it is the narrative hinge on which much of the whole northern adventure swings. That centrality matters because it made Freeland harder to discard. If the island vanished, much of the story's coherence would vanish with it. One can survive a wrong peninsula or an awkward coastline more easily than one can survive the disappearance of the place where the adventure begins, the prince resides, and the travellers establish their northern footing. The map and the letters support one another. The map says, "There is Freeland." The letters say, "We were there." Together they create a self-reinforcing performance of credibility. The island is not merely drawn, it is inhabited in prose. It is given political structure, military relevance, and the sort of practical geographic attention that fantasy islands often lack. This is one reason Frisland proved so successful. It was not introduced as a mythic wonder, it was introduced as a working island, a place where things happened, and it is detailed, remarkably detailed. The Old World Auctions essay notes that Frisland is by far the most detailed of the spurious islands on the Zeno Map, even more detailed than some actual islands shown there. That observation is deeply revealing. A complete fabrication might be expected to stay vague for safety. Frisland does the opposite. It leans into specificity. It gives the eye things to trust. Settlements, coastlines, internal features, neighbouring islets. These are the visual equivalents of speaking confidently in a room where everyone else is uncertain. A richly drawn phantom can be more persuasive than a poorly drawn reality, especially if the surrounding map contains enough genuine-looking geography to make the whole composition feel respectable. This, I think, is where Frisland becomes more than a historical curiosity and starts acting like a lesson in how error gains momentum. Most people do not believe in non-existent islands because they enjoy being wrong. They believe in them because the island is introduced under favourable conditions. It appears in a plausible region. It is endorsed by a narrative. It is accompanied by some real geography. It gets picked up by respected intermediaries, and then, crucially, later authorities copy it. The Old World Auctions article explains that Girolamo Ruscelli reproduced the Zeno geography in 1561, praising Zeno the Younger's superior knowledge, and that Gerardus Mercator then incorporated Freeland into his epical 1569 world map and later Arctic works, while Abraham Ortelius also kept it in circulation. That sequence is enormously important. Once Mercator and Ortelius begin entertaining your island, you're no longer just a rumour. your institutionally endorsed confusion. It is hard to overstate what that did for Friesland's career. A solitary mistake can be shrugged off. A repeated mistake becomes a tradition. And tradition, especially in mapping, can take on a life of its own because later cartographers are often working with inherited authorities rather than with first-hand observation. Mercator's 1569 world map was one of the foundational monuments of early modern cartography. If Freyland appears there, then the island is no longer merely a Venetian family oddity. It is now part of the visual furniture of learned geography. The same is true, in a slightly different register, of Ortelius's atlases. The Old World Auctions essay notes that Ortelius's use of Friesland had real-world consequences. Frobisher consulted the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, and John Dee even treated Greenland, Friesland and Estotiland as territories that could matter to imperial thinking. A fake island had become geopolitically useful. There is something almost comical in that. Though history's humour can be a little dry, imagine the administrative confidence required to contemplate claims involving a land that does not exist. And yet it makes sense. Cartography does not just reflect exploration, it guides expectation. If a well-regarded atlas says there is an island in a given region, then navigators, patrons and political dreamers may begin behaving as though the island is waiting to be found, occupied or interpreted. A map trains perception. It tells explorers what might be there, and sometimes, disastrously, it tells them what they are already seeing. The Old World Auctions article describes exactly this dynamic in the case of Martin Frobisher, whose circle believed what they encountered agreed well enough with Friesland to confirm the Zeno tradition. The eye met a coast, and the paper had already supplied the name. This is one of the reasons Friesland lasted so long. It was not just copied by map makers, it was fed by the uncertainty of real northern navigation. The North Atlantic is a region where fog, poor visibility, variable ice, dangerous currents, and incomplete surveying historically made misidentification much easier than many modern readers suppose. The older the period, the less absurd it becomes that an explorer might think he has found one island when in fact he's approached another coast entirely. The Library of Congress points out that Freyland's depiction varied significantly from one map to another, which suggests cartographers were not all copying a single fixed truth, but rather reworking and adapting a phantom whose exact form was itself unstable. That instability did not weaken belief at first, it may actually have helped it. Real coastlines on early maps often varied too. Variation looked like imperfection, not necessarily fraud. Still, once one accepts that Friesland did not exist, another question rises immediately and refuses to sit down. If there was no Friesland, then what was happening? Was it pure invention? Was it Iceland doubled? Were the Faroes stretched and relocated? Was Greenland's coast misread? Or did several different confusions pile on top of one another until the result became a new island entirely? Scholars and later commentators have offered multiple identifications. The Ruderman essay notes that some thought Friesland represented part of Iceland, while older interpreters had also tried to match different Zeno names to various North Atlantic locations. The difficulty is that none of these rescues is entirely comfortable. A clean identification would be satisfying, but Friesland seems to resist that courtesy. Part of the problem is that Friesland is too developed to be a simple accidental duplicate, and too unstable to be a straightforward memory of a real island. If it were merely Iceland displaced, one would expect the surrounding geographic logic to settle more neatly. If it were simply the Faroes enlarged, the amount of detail and the scale feel excessive. If it were Greenland misread, the position and narrative role create other difficulties. What we may be seeing instead is one of those particularly historical creatures, made not of one error, but of many. A compounded land. A cluster of names, reports, copied shapes and inherited assumptions, gradually congealed into something larger and more distinct than any of its ingredients. Human beings are very good at doing this. Give us fragments, and if the fragments are interesting enough, we will eventually arrange them into an island. That possibility helps explain why Friesland could become, as the Geographicus summary dryly puts it, the utterly imaginary island of Friesland, shown with greater detail than Iceland. There is a slight sting in that phrasing, and rightly so. The absurdity of giving a phantom better treatment than a real island is exactly what makes Friesland such a compelling example of cartographic overconfidence. But it also reveals the psychology of the thing. We are often most elaborate where we are least secure. Detail can function as compensation. A vague rumour dressed in precise line work feels less like rumour and more like knowledge. Put enough towns on a non-existent island and it begins to embarrass doubt. Another reason Friesland matters is that it reminds us phantom islands were not rare anomalies in the age of sail. The history of cartography is full of them. Some began in mistaken sightings. Some resulted from navigational error. Some were products of atmospheric distortion or wishful interpretation. Some were duplicated from one map to another because no one wanted to be the first to erase them. In that broader company, Friesland is both typical and exceptional. Typical because it belongs to a known family of maritime ghosts. Exceptional because it was given such a rich textual and cartographic apparatus by the Zeno publication and then amplified by major cartographers for so long. The Library of Congress notes that Friesland remained on maps into the 18th century in some cases, even as the North Atlantic became better charted. That longevity is a measure not only of confusion but of inertia. Once an island is established, erasing it can take generations. In a strange way, Friesland also reveals how much people wanted there to be something in that part of the ocean. The Old World Auctions article quotes Genevieve Carleton to the effect that hope plus a veneer of truth turned Friesland into a real island in the European imagination because it fit what people wanted to find in the ocean, new lands ready for use and exploitation. Even setting aside the rhetoric of exploitation, the broader point stands. Empty spaces on a map are unsatisfying to empires, merchants and scholars alike. A named island promises route, refuge, staging point, possession, narrative. It gives structure to uncertainty. Friesland therefore answered a psychological and practical appetite long before it answered reality. That appetite may also help us understand why later doubt took time to prevail. It was not enough for someone to say, rather sensibly, "I have never seen Friesland." Absence is a weaker dramatic force than a printed island backed by famous names. To defeat Friesland, critics needed not only skepticism but a better charted Atlantic and a stronger culture of historical checking. By the 19th century, that culture had improved enough that figures like Christian Zartmann and especially Frederick W. Lucas could attack the Zeno material more forcefully. The Old World Auctions and Ruderman essays both note Lucas's 1898 work as a major demolition of the Zeno geography, accusing Niccolo the Younger of making the map up from other cartographic materials and scattering islands where they did not belong. By then, Friesland could finally start to sink, not beneath the ocean, but beneath accumulated evidence. Yet I think there is a reason Friesland still fascinates, and it is not just because the story is amusing. It is because the island sits at the intersection of several very human habits. We like inherited authority. We like detailed stories. We like the possibility that old maps preserve forgotten truths. We like to think that errors come from simple foolishness in other people, and not from the same kind of pattern-seeking confidence we still possess ourselves. Friesland is uncomfortable because it shows all of those habits at work in a form we can easily recognise. It is a ghost made of credibility cues. It was born from narrative, dressed in cartographic specificity, vouched for by famous intermediaries, and sustained by the difficulty of proving a negative on a dangerous ocean. And despite being false, it was not meaningless. That is another subtle point worth holding on to. A phantom island can still tell us real things. Friesland tells us about the authority of print in the 16th century, about the circulation of northern geographical ideas, about the rivalry of maritime prestige, about the conservatism of cartographic copying, and about the role of expectation in exploration. It tells us that maps are not neutral containers of fact, but active participants in historical imagination. A fake island changed real voyages. That is not nothing. It is, in its own mischievous way, a kind of existence. So Frisland occupies a peculiar status. It is not a lost land in the geological sense. It was not swallowed by waves or buried under ice. It is a lost land of another kind, one that existed socially, intellectually, and visually for centuries before reality finally insisted on the inconvenience of its absence. It was a place made from confidence, and confidence can be one of the most durable building materials in history. At the same time, the story does not end with simply laughing Friesland off the map. Once we accept that one grand island in the Zeno tradition was phantom, a more complicated question follows. Not every distortion on the map is necessarily pure invention. Some features may reflect real coasts seen badly, borrowed from other northern traditions, or altered by conditions that genuinely changed over time. If Freyland shows what paper can invent, Greenland raises a slightly different possibility. That some of the strangeness on the map comes not from an island that never existed, but from coastlines, ice, and northern geography that were understood differently because the world itself, or at least its visible edges, did not always look the way we're used to seeing them now. Once Freeland has been allowed to drift off into the category of confident non-existence, the eye naturally moves to Greenland, because Greenland is where the Zeno Map becomes more difficult in a different way. A phantom island can be laughed at eventually, or at least corrected with a certain firmness. A real landmass that has been drawn strangely is a more stubborn problem. Greenland is not a rumour. It is very much there. It has coasts, fjords, ice, settlements, long histories of contact and abandonment, and an inconvenient habit of looking different depending on where you approach it, what season you arrive in, what century you belong to, and how much of its margin is hidden by sea ice or glaciers. That is what makes Greenland so useful to the Zeno mystery. It allows a map to be badly wrong without being entirely absurd. A changed coast is always easier to imagine than a made-up island. This matters because old northern mapping lived in a world where Greenland was known, but not known in the crisp, disciplined way a modern atlas would like. Medieval and early modern cartographers often worked with fragments. They had inherited traditions from Norse settlement and church geography, second-hand reports from sailors, coastal impressions, and the sort of piecemeal information that becomes especially unreliable once sea ice, weather, and difficult landfalls are involved. The Greenlander continental scholar knew on paper was not necessarily the Greenlander sailor glimpsed from a dangerous deck, and neither of them was seeing the same Greenland a person living in a fjord might understand intimately. The Greenland represented on the Zeno map therefore belongs to a world of layered knowledge, where some things were remembered, some copied, and some guessed with far more confidence than the conditions justified. There is a temptation, especially in more dramatic retellings of the Zeno story, to imagine that the strange shape of Greenland on the map must preserve access to some vanished coastline, some forgotten pre-ice landscape, or a configuration of shore and open water that later centuries lost beneath colder conditions. It is an exciting thought. It is also a dangerous one because Greenland is exactly the sort of place where a little environmental truth can be made to carry far too much interpretive weight. Yes, coasts change. Yes, sea ice varies dramatically over time. Yes, sea level can alter shorelines. Yes, glaciers advance and retreat. But none of that means a 16th century printed map with suspect lineage is secretly showing us an accurate medieval or prehistoric Greenland no one else preserved. The reality is more restrained and in some ways more interesting. Greenland's margins are dynamic enough that older observers could genuinely encounter conditions quite different from those we imagine now, yet not so different that a wildly distorted map becomes trustworthy by default. The scholarly challenge is to hold both facts at once without letting either one run away with the whole story. The historical and environmental record gives us good reason to think Greenland's coastal conditions have changed significantly over long periods. Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland material on Norse Greenland notes that late Holocene sea level change in southern Greenland involved ongoing transgression and drowning of earlier coastlines, with sea level continuing to rise through the Norse era into the present in some areas. Their summary suggests an average late Holocene sea level rise on the order of 2 to 3 metres per thousand years in relevant regions, and notes that this may have contributed to the pressures faced by Norse communities, alongside increasing wind and sea ice expansion at the transition toward the Little Ice Age. That is not the sort of dramatic overnight submergence popular imagination likes, but it is enough to remind us that medieval Greenland was not a fixed stage set. Shorelines, usable grazing land, harbour conditions, and the relation between sea and settlement were all subject to slow but real change, and sea ice is just as important as shoreline. If you look at East Greenland in particular, the difference between an approachable coast and a forbidding one can depend less on the rock itself than on the floating and fast ice around it. Research on East Greenland's environmental history shows that the position of the summer sea ice margin has shifted substantially through the Holocene, influenced by changing ocean conditions and the strength of currents such as the East Greenland Current. The long environmental reconstruction in the Alfred Wegener Institute publication describes intervals when the summer sea ice margin lay farther north than today, and other periods when coastal ice conditions intensified and pushed farther south, affecting fjords, seabird feeding conditions and glacier behaviour. That does not hand us a ready-made explanation for the Zeno Map's geography, but it does warn us against assuming that medieval mariners and early map makers were all looking at a North Atlantic identical to the one stabilised in our mental picture by modern charts and satellite imagery. This is where Greenland becomes especially slippery in relation to the Zeno Map. A distorted Greenland can attract two opposite mistakes. One mistake is to dismiss every oddity as pure fabrication and forget that real northern environments were difficult to map and genuinely variable. The other is to overcorrect and assume that any oddity might preserve forbidden or impossible knowledge of a Greenland that looked radically different. The safer path is less theatrical. It is entirely plausible that some strange aspects of Greenland's depiction on the map reflect inherited northern mapping traditions, filtered through poor copying and uncertain observation. It is also plausible that changing sea ice and local coastal access shaped what mariners thought they were seeing or could reach. What is not especially plausible is that the Zeno Map gives us a reliable portrait of Greenland from centuries ahead of the broader cartographic record, while every other piece of evidence politely failed to notice. One reason the question persists is that Greenland has long been a place where European mapping lagged behind reality. The Greenlandic Historical Overview of Mapping emphasises that even as late as the 18th century, mapping the coast and deep fjords depended heavily on direct exploration, and that the indication of the inland ice sheet on early maps cannot be attributed to proper survey. That is a useful reminder. Greenland is enormous, difficult, and deceptive at scale. A coast may be known locally in pieces long before it is coherently assembled cartographically. Deep fjords complicate any simple outline, and the visibility of ice and land can vary dramatically depending on season and route. If a 16th century compiler inherited fragments of Greenland geography from multiple traditions, it would not be surprising for the result to look both suggestive and wrong. There is also the historical shadow of the Norse settlements. Greenland was not an unknown abstraction to medieval Europe. Norse immigrants settled there around the end of the 10th century, and their communities endured for centuries before disappearing. The Geosummary on late Holocene sea level change places Norse settlement around AD 985 and notes that these communities persisted for about 500 years. That matters because a mapmaker working in later centuries could inherit names, rough locations, and stories linked to Greenland without possessing a stable, modern geographical frame for them. A remembered Christian outpost at the edge of a shifting, icy coast is the kind of thing that can persist in text and rumour long after exact spatial understanding has degraded. Once you add in the difficulties of transmission between Norse, Icelandic, Latin, Venetian, and later printed traditions, Greenland becomes fertile ground for distortions that are neither pure fantasy nor secure knowledge. And that may be the best way to understand the Zeno Map's Greenland, as a place where environmental reality and cartographic instability overlap. Greenland's coast was hard to know in full. Ice conditions could hide, open or redefine access seasonally, and over longer climatic shifts. Fjords made the coastline complex. Sea level change affected low-lying usable land in the south over long timescales. A region like that is perfect for generating both genuine memory and lasting confusion. If one copied from earlier northern maps, borrowed names from inherited traditions, and then tried to integrate all of that into a broader North Atlantic chart, the result could easily look like something uncanny. It would feel as though it knew a Greenland that no longer exists, when in fact it might simply be preserving pieces of several Greenlands at once. The Norse Greenland of settlement memory, the icebound Greenland of difficult sailing reports, the partly schematized Greenland of continental cartographers, and the 16th century Greenland of printers trying to make a coherent map out of stubbornly incoherent materials. There is another subtle issue here, which is that when coastlines are difficult, map makers often compensate with confidence. A complicated fjord system can be simplified. An inaccessible icebound sector can be regularized. A half-known coast can be attached more neatly to neighbouring geography than it should be. This does not always produce obvious nonsense. Often it produces those especially irritating old maps that are wrong in structure but right enough in mood to keep luring people back. Greenland on the Zeno Map belongs to that species. It may give the impression of preserving forgotten or impossible shape, not because it truly records a vanished coastal outline, but because it gathers together bits of real northern complexity and then forces them into a cleaner but less truthful arrangement. Climate history strengthens this impression without rescuing the map. The environmental record for East Greenland described in the AWI study includes periods of warmer conditions with glacier recession toward roughly present positions in some inner fjords, followed by later cooling phases and renewed glacier advance. The same long arc includes shifts in sea ice transport and summer sea ice margins. That tells us Greenland's coastal environment has indeed changed repeatedly over millennia, and even within the late Holocene these changes could affect accessibility and appearance in meaningful ways. But that still leaves us with the difference between environmental plausibility and cartographic proof. A changing coast can help explain why northern reports became inconsistent. It cannot by itself authenticate a problematic map. This distinction becomes especially important whenever people try to turn Greenland into the master key for the Zeno Map. One often hears versions of the argument that perhaps the map preserves a time before heavier ice coverage concealed parts of the coast, or a time when mariners could perceive outlines later hidden. As a general proposition, there is some sense in saying that different ice conditions can change what is navigable and what is visible. Historical and modern studies of East Greenland sea ice show exactly that variability matters. But as an explanation for the Zeno Map's whole Greenland problem, it is not enough. The map's issues are not merely environmental, they are textual, genealogical and cartographic. Its suspected borrowing from later sources does not vanish because Greenland's sea ice once behaved differently. A changing coast may explain some confusion. It does not magically convert a composite 16th century chart into a faithful 14th century witness. What Greenland does offer, however, is a useful warning against the modern habit of treating coastlines as eternal. Even now we know Greenland's ice system is dynamic, and modern ice velocity mapping shows just how active the ice sheet and outlet glaciers are across the island. That modern dynamic is not evidence for a specific Zeno feature, but it reinforces the larger point that Greenland is not a static block of white with a simple edge. It is a moving, changing cryospheric system meeting a highly irregular coast. Historical observers encountering that system under different conditions would not necessarily produce the neat and repeatable spatial knowledge we expect today. There is also the quieter matter of scale. Slow shoreline change of a few meters per millennium in parts of southern Greenland does not sound dramatic, until one remembers how much medieval farming communities, landing places, and coastal meadows depended on small differences in relative sea level. The GEUS summary suggests that flooding of fertile grassland may have been one factor affecting the Norse settlements. That does not redraw Greenland in the grand cartographic sense, but it does remind us that lands that don't exist anymore need not mean Atlantis-style disappearance. Sometimes it means low meadows lost to transgression, usable margins narrowed by sea level rise, or settlement landscapes altered enough that later generations no longer encounter quite the same coastal world. If the Zeno tradition vaguely preserves a Greenland attached to older phases of use and memory, that would be far more plausible than the claim that it secretly mapped a radically different continental outline. And in a way, that is the more interesting possibility anyway. A map does not have to be accurate in the modern sense to preserve traces of a changing world. It can preserve memory of access routes that later became difficult. It can preserve naming traditions tied to vanished communities. It can preserve the cartographic afterimage of regions known under one climatic mood and then revisited under another. Greenland, with its Norse history, its sea ice variability, its shifting coastal margins and its difficult east coast, is exactly the sort of place where that kind of half-memory could arise. The resulting map would still be wrong. It might still be deeply wrong. But its wrongness would not be empty. It would be the wrongness of an inherited world no longer fully legible. That, I think, is why Greenland keeps pulling the Zeno debate away from simple fraud. Even if the printed map was assembled later, and even if its strongest claims collapse under scrutiny, Greenland prevents the whole affair from becoming trivial. It keeps a door open to the possibility that some of the map's strangeness reflects not secret impossible knowledge, but fragmented knowledge of a real northern environment that was difficult, variable, and altered over time. The challenge is not to romanticize that possibility into certainty. The challenge is to let Greenland remain complicated without turning complication into proof. So the picture that emerges is less dramatic but more durable. The Zeno Map is not a miraculous window onto a lost Greenland that modern science forgot. But neither is Greenland on the map merely random decoration. It sits at the crossroads of real environmental change, incomplete medieval and early modern knowledge, inherited Norse memory, copied cartographic tradition, and the ordinary human urge to make a coast look more knowable than it really is. In that sense, Greenland is one of the best examples in the whole story of how a map can preserve fragments of a world that no longer exists in the same way, while still failing as a trustworthy guide to what that world actually looked like. And once Greenland forces us to admit that real northern geography could change enough to feed lasting confusion, the next question becomes harder to avoid. If changing coasts and ice can explain some distortions, could the Zeno tradition also be carrying something else through its mistakes? Not a hidden master map, but the faint memory of voyages, routes, or contacts that later historians found easier to dismiss than to reconstruct. That is where the argument shifts again, away from coastlines themselves and toward the more provocative possibility that beneath all this confusion there may still be traces of exploration that official history never learned how to file neatly. Once Greenland has forced us to admit that even real coastlines can look unfamiliar across time, the question that quietly follows is not entirely comfortable. If some of the distortions on the Zeno map come from confusion, copying, or environmental change, is it possible that some small part of it might also preserve the memory of voyages that later history did not keep in clear focus? Not great voyages in the dramatic sense, not world-changing expeditions that slipped mysteriously out of the record, but smaller, less formal movements across the North Atlantic. Sailors who reached places, reported what they could, and left behind fragments that were later misunderstood, exaggerated, or misplaced. It is a tempting idea, and it has been one of the reasons the Zeno map refuses to settle quietly into the category of forgery and stay there. A completely invented map would not keep inviting rescue. This one does, because parts of it feel like they might be echoes rather than inventions. But before following that thread too far, it is worth slowing down and asking what kind of forgotten voyages we are even talking about, and what sort of evidence they would be expected to leave behind if they had occurred. The North Atlantic was not empty in the centuries before Columbus. Norse exploration and settlement are well established, with voyages from Iceland to Greenland and even to parts of North America centuries earlier. That fact alone makes it easier for later readers to imagine that other, less well-documented journeys might also have taken place. If one group of sailors could cross those waters in the medieval period, then perhaps others could too. The ocean does not reserve itself for official narratives. It allows passage to anyone with a ship, a reason, and a certain tolerance for risk. But possibility is not proof, and this is where the Zeno Map enters uncertain territory. The story attached to the map suggests that the Zeno brothers encountered lands west of Greenland, and possibly even beyond what was widely known at the time. Names like Estotiland and Drogeo have therefore been interpreted by some as hints of North America, or at least of western lands that later became part of that story. Over the centuries, writers have returned to this possibility again and again, trying to match these names to Newfoundland, Labrador, or other coastal regions. It is not difficult to see why. The idea that a Venetian-linked voyage might have reached western lands before Columbus has a certain narrative appeal. However, most historians have been far less enthusiastic about that conclusion. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography describes the Zeno narrative as a fabrication, and emphasises that the map and letters were constructed from later sources, rather than from genuine 14th century voyages. That assessment does not leave much room for treating the Zeno account as reliable evidence of forgotten exploration. It suggests instead that whatever fragments of northern knowledge appear in the map are more likely inherited from existing traditions than derived from unique first-hand journeys by the Zeno brothers themselves. And yet, even within that skepticism, there remains a quieter possibility. A fabricated or heavily altered document can still contain traces of real information, especially if it was built from earlier materials. The question then becomes not whether the Zeno brothers personally made these voyages, but whether the map, through its borrowed elements, preserves distorted memories of travel that were already circulating in Northern Europe. This is where the history of Norse exploration becomes relevant again, not as a dramatic alternative explanation, but as a reminder of how knowledge can fragment. The Norse voyages to Greenland and beyond were real, but they were not preserved in a single unified European narrative. They survived in sagas, in local traditions, in partial geographic awareness, and in scattered references that did not always integrate smoothly into continental cartography. By the time Renaissance mapmakers were assembling their charts, they were often working with incomplete and unevenly transmitted knowledge of these earlier journeys. It is entirely plausible that some of this fragmented knowledge filtered into later maps in distorted form. A name might survive while its location shifted. A report of land might be attached to the wrong coastline. A general awareness of Western territories might be compressed into a single island. In that sense, a map like the Zeno Map could be seen not as a record of new discovery, but as a confused echo of older exploration traditions that had already lost their original clarity. The Rare Maps essay reflects this tension when it notes that some have believed the Zeno Map might provide evidence of exploration in North America before Columbus, while others view it as an example of the imaginative tendencies of early cartography. That divide captures the central difficulty. The same features that invite speculation about forgotten voyages can also be explained by the known habits of map-making in the period. Another factor complicating the idea of forgotten voyages is the nature of historical survival. Significant expeditions tend to leave multiple traces. They appear in administrative records, in correspondence, in economic accounts, in independent reports, or in later traditions that can be cross-checked. The Zeno narrative, by contrast, depends heavily on a single late publication, with a convenient family origin story and damaged originals. That is not how robust historical evidence usually behaves. It does not mean no voyage ever occurred. but it does make it very difficult to treat the map as a reliable witness to such voyages. There is also the matter of how early modern readers interpreted exploration. In the 16th century, the distinction between confirmed geography and plausible report was not always sharply drawn. A credible narrative did not require the same level of verification we would expect today. If a map or text seemed consistent with known patterns and did not contradict accepted ideas too obviously, it could be incorporated into the broader understanding of the world. That environment made it easier for a story like the Zeno voyages to be accepted, at least temporarily, as part of the expanding picture of the North Atlantic. At the same time, the very success of the Zeno Map in influencing later cartographers suggests that it was filling a gap rather than revealing a hidden truth. The North Atlantic was still poorly understood in many respects, and there was a demand for maps that could organise that uncertainty into something more manageable. The Zeno Map provided that structure, even if it did so imperfectly. It offered names, routes, and relationships that could be used, copied, and adapted. In that sense, its influence may say more about the needs of its audience than about the accuracy of its content. Still, it would be too simple to dismiss the entire question of forgotten voyages as mere fantasy. The history of exploration is full of small journeys that left only faint traces. Fishing expeditions, trading ventures, accidental landfalls, and seasonal movements could all occur without generating the kind of documentation that survives clearly. The North Atlantic, with its rich fisheries and scattered islands, was a region where such activity could plausibly take place. It is not unreasonable to imagine that sailors reached places that were not immediately incorporated into formal geographic knowledge. What is more difficult is connecting those hypothetical journeys to the specific details of the Zeno Map. The map does not present itself as a collection of vague possibilities. It presents a structured geography with named lands and defined relationships. That level of organisation suggests either a coherent source or a deliberate construction. If it were preserving genuine but fragmented voyage knowledge, one might expect more ambiguity, not less. Instead, the map often appears more confident than the evidence supporting it. There is also a psychological element to consider. The idea of forgotten voyages is appealing because it offers a sense of hidden depth in history. It suggests that the past is richer and more mysterious than the official record allows. That can be true, but it can also lead to over-interpretation. When faced with an unusual map, it is tempting to assume that its anomalies must point to something real rather than to the ordinary processes of error, copying, and imagination. The Zeno Map sits precisely at that intersection, where curiosity can either lead to careful analysis or to increasingly elaborate speculation. In the end, the most balanced view may be the least dramatic one. The Zeno Map likely does not preserve direct evidence of forgotten Venetian voyages to unknown western lands. The scholarly consensus that it is a later construction based on existing sources is strong and well supported. At the same time, the map may still reflect the broader environment of knowledge in which it was created, including fragmented awareness of northern geography and earlier exploration traditions. That makes it less of a hidden treasure and more of a historical mirror. It shows us what people in the 16th century thought might be possible, what they were willing to believe, and how they assembled pieces of information into a coherent picture. It preserves not the voyages themselves, but the idea of voyages shaped by memory, ambition, and the limits of available knowledge. And that idea is not trivial. It reminds us that exploration is not only about where people go, but about how those journeys are remembered, interpreted, and sometimes transformed into something else entirely. A map can turn a rumour into a coastline, a story into an island, and a fragment of truth into a geography that never quite existed. Which leaves us with a quieter, more grounded question. If the Zeno Map is not a record of lost expeditions, but a reflection of how knowledge was assembled and sometimes distorted, then perhaps the more important mystery is not what voyages it preserves, but how the physical world itself may have contributed to that distortion. Because even without forgotten explorers, the North Atlantic has always been a place where land and sea interact in ways that can erase, reshape, or conceal geography over time. And that brings us to the next part of the story, where the focus shifts away from ships and toward the ocean itself, and the slow, persistent changes that can make a coastline seem to disappear. Long before anyone argued over whether the Zeno brothers sailed where they said they sailed, the sea had already been doing what it does best, which is to ignore our need for stable edges. We tend to think of coastlines as if they were fixed lines waiting patiently for a cartographer to come along and trace them properly, but a coastline is not a wall. It is a negotiation. It shifts with tide, storm, sediment, ice, erosion, uplift, subsidence, and the slow rearrangement of land and water over centuries. Sometimes the changes are dramatic enough to be noticed within a lifetime. More often they are gradual, the sort of thing that only becomes obvious when an old harbour silts up, a meadow goes marshy, a landing beach narrows, or the ruins of a building are found farther out in the intertidal zone than any sensible builder would have chosen. This matters for the Zeno Map because once we stop asking only whether its islands are real and start asking how the physical world itself changes, a more grounded mystery appears. Not lost continents, not forbidden atlases, just the ordinary, relentless power of shorelines to stop being where people remember them. That sort of change can do odd things to maps and memories alike. A sailor visits a coast under one set of conditions, reports an inlet, a low shore, a landing place, perhaps a cluster of islets. 2 centuries later, someone else approaches the same region after storms, sea level rise, glacier retreat, or shifting sediment have altered what can be seen or safely reached. The second observer does not necessarily conclude that the first was lying. More often the result is confusion. Perhaps the map is copied with a correction here and a guess there. Perhaps an old place name is kept even though the specific feature it once referred to has merged, eroded, flooded, or become inaccessible. In that way, the sea does not merely swallow shore, it swallows certainty. The coastline remains real enough, but the relationship between name, shape, and memory begins to fray. Greenland offers one version of this problem, as we have already seen. In southern Greenland, relative sea level change through the late Holocene continued into and beyond the Norse period, affecting coastal margins and potentially drowning low-lying land that had once been useful for grazing and settlement. Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland material specifically notes continuing marine transgression in southern Greenland and suggests that flooding of fertile grasslands may have been one of several contributing pressures on Norse communities there. That is a sobering reminder that land lost to the sea need not mean some cinematic catastrophe. It can mean the narrowing of usable margins, the slow conversion of meadow to marsh, the worsening of harbour approaches, and the gradual mismatch between inherited place descriptions and the coast one actually encounters. Once you start looking for that pattern beyond Greenland, it becomes clear that it is not unusual. Around the North Atlantic and the North Sea, entire settlement landscapes have been transformed or submerged over long periods. Sea level histories compiled by agencies such as the US Environmental Protection Agency summarize the broad post-glacial trend. Global sea level rose rapidly after the last ice age, then more slowly over the last several thousand years, though local relative sea level depended on uplift, subsidence, and regional conditions. The key point for historical geography is that coastlines visible to Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, medieval, or early modern communities were not always the same coastlines later mapped under calmer assumptions of permanence. Even where the absolute changes were measured in metres rather than dramas, a few metres can make an extraordinary difference in low-lying coastal environments. Now, to be fair, the Zeno Map is not a map of the drowned North Sea plains or some vanished Mesolithic coast. It belongs to a later and colder northern world, but the general principle still matters. Early mapmakers often dealt with regions where the physical margins of land had changed enough, or appeared differently enough, to complicate inherited reports. Add storm damage, heavy seas, sea ice, variable visibility, and the tendency of sailors to describe only what mattered for approach and landing, and you can see how a shoreline might remain known in one sense while becoming unstable in another. The mapmaker receives not a fixed outline, but a stack of impressions. This inlet can still be entered. That church now stands near marsh. A low island may once have been larger. A harbour used by earlier generations is no longer safe. A cluster of rocks awash at high tide becomes, in another person's telling, a dangerous islet. The physical coast shifts first, then the verbal coast shifts after it. There are many historical cases of the sea quite literally removing inhabited ground from the record. England's dunnage is one of the most famous examples in the medieval North Sea world. Historic England explains that what was once one of medieval England's major ports, and a substantial town on the Suffolk coast, was progressively destroyed by storms and coastal erosion, with much of the old town now underwater. That happened over centuries, not in a single theatrical gulp, but the result is the same from the point of view of geography. A place that once had streets, churches and civic importance no longer occupies the landward footprint people once knew. If a coastline with that sort of history were preserved mainly through partial reports and copied maps, one can easily imagine later confusion about what exactly earlier descriptions referred to. A similar lesson appears in the Low Countries, where the sea and human settlement have been in long conversation, and not always a polite one. Rijkswaterstaat's historical overview notes that much of the Dutch landscape has been shaped by the interaction of sea level rise, storm surges, sedimentation, peat extraction, dike building, and reclamation. In such environments, maps are never just descriptions. They are snapshots taken during an ongoing argument between water and land use. Medieval and early modern coastlines in the North Sea world were therefore not just cartographic problems, but active political and economic ones. Again, that does not authenticate the Zeno Map, but it reminds us that when old maps seem uncertain around maritime margins, they may be responding to a reality that was itself less stable than modern readers instinctively assume. And perhaps that is where the more sensible version of the Lost Lands idea belongs. Not in Atlantis-style fantasies, but in the knowledge that coastal worlds can be physically altered enough to make old names and outlines feel ghostly later on. A map may preserve memory of a shoreline before erosion clipped it back. It may reflect navigation around barrier islands that later shifted. It may remember a landing place now useless. It may encode a town or monastery once near water but later isolated by marsh, sediment or flooding. The sea can make a truthful report look false to later readers by changing the thing reported. This is not only a northern phenomenon. Archaeological and geological work around Europe and the British Isles has repeatedly shown how many coastlines once supported landscapes now partly submerged. The broad Doggerland literature, for example, has made many people aware that large areas beneath the present North Sea were dry land in prehistory. University of Bradford and University of Birmingham summaries describe Doggerland as a Mesolithic landscape gradually inundated by post-glacial sea level rise, changing from habitable plain to wetlands and eventually to seabed. That is far earlier than the Zeno material, of course, but it serves as a useful reminder that the map in our head of what ought to be there is often a very late map. Coastlines are historical documents too. They have additions. Still, it is important not to let this turn into a universal solvent for cartographic errors. The sea swallowed it is a wonderfully convenient explanation when an old map goes astray, and convenient explanations should be handled with care. Many supposed lost lands on early maps were simply mistakes. Some were duplicated islands, some were rumours hardened into ink, some were bad coordinate estimates, some were copyists doing what copyists do when a marginal note, a coastline and a place name are all trying to occupy the same narrow strip of page. The fact that real coastlines can change does not mean every phantom island deserves parole. Freeland remains a phantom no matter how charitable one becomes about sea level history. The challenge is to distinguish between physically plausible coastal change and the ordinary habits of error. Where the sea becomes most useful in reading the Zeno tradition is not as a magic excuse, but as a source of distortion and misinterpretation. If a mariner's report described broken coasts, low islands, dangerous shoals, seasonal approaches, and changing ice or water conditions, a later compiler might easily over-regularize them into a simpler shape. Conversely, if a coastal landscape had genuinely altered since an earlier report, the compiler might preserve an older naming scheme while drawing a newer or guessed outline. The result would not be a clean lie, it would be a layered mistake, partly historical, partly environmental, and layered mistakes are often the most persistent kind because some part of them always seems capable of being defended. Consider the role of storm surges and coastal flooding in historical memory. Medieval chroniclers and local traditions often remembered catastrophic marine events long after the exact physical geography had changed again. In the North Sea world, major storm floods repeatedly redrew coastal margins. The Dutch historical material from Rijkswaterstaat points to the St. Elizabeth's flood of 1421 as one dramatic example of how flooding reshaped inhabited landscapes and water systems. If even well-documented regions with strong administrative traditions could experience that sort of shoreline reorganisation, it becomes much easier to imagine how more remote northern coasts, lightly surveyed and poorly integrated into continental mapping, could produce generations of confused geographic inheritance. Then, there is the way coasts are experienced differently depending on what the traveller cares about. A modern map values continuity and measurement. A sailor often values safe water, anchorages, landmarks and warnings. A settlement values access to grazing, fresh water, shelter and communications. A cleric may care whether a bishopric or monastery exists there. A trader may care whether a harbour can be reached reliably. These are not the same coast. They overlap but unevenly. If an early map or narrative combines reports from such different priorities, the resulting geography can look inconsistent not because no one knew anything, but because different people knew different versions of the shore. Once the sea begins changing those local conditions, the inconsistency grows worse. The landing place is not where it was. The sandbank has shifted. The channel is dangerous now. The island may only be an island at certain states of tide or after storm alteration. The map inherits all of this without ever receiving a proper explanatory footnote, and perhaps this is one reason the Zeno Map continues to seem as though it might preserve fragments of a world no longer available to direct inspection. Early northern coasts were often encountered piecemeal and under difficulty. Some communities vanished, some names were forgotten. Some coasts grew less accessible under colder conditions. Some low margins were lost slowly to transgression or erosion. A 16th century compiler working with mixed sources could therefore produce a chart full of features that feel half real, because they are half real in several different senses. A harbour may be real but misplaced. A coastal region may be real but over-islanded. A landfall remembered from one period may be shown under the conditions of another. The sea does not merely erase, it also edits. The editing can be surprisingly selective. It may spare high rock and remove low ground. It may preserve inland ruins while taking the keys. It may leave the place name alive in records but detach it from the exact feature it once described. Historic England's account of Dunwich makes this vivid. Large parts of the medieval town are gone beneath the sea, yet the name survives, the memory survives, the historical importance survives, and underwater archaeology continues to recover parts of the lost urban fabric. In other words, the place both exists and does not exist anymore, depending on what one means by existence. Something similar may haunt early maps. A named coastal world may survive textually after the physical arrangements that gave rise to it have shifted beyond easy recognition. This is also why discussions of lands that don't exist anymore are usually more persuasive when they become smaller and more local rather than grand and cinematic. Entire continents do not politely vanish within recorded history. but shore meadows, fishing stations, tidal islands, dune systems and vulnerable ports do change or disappear. Relative sea level rise of a couple of meters over a millennium can matter tremendously in a low coastal setting. Repeated storms can undo human investment much faster. Erosion can cut back soft coasts year by year, and in cold environments, changing ice can alter both visibility and access in ways that make remembered routes feel like routes to another geography entirely. So, if we are asking what the sea contributes to the Zeno puzzle, the answer is not proof of miraculous foresight. It is instability. It makes reports harder to compare across time. It increases the chance that a real place will be drawn wrongly later. It encourages the preservation of names after their reference have changed. It rewards cartographers who smooth over complication and punishes those who admit uncertainty. And because the sea changes coasts while also concealing evidence, it can make the most cautious explanation feel unsatisfyingly incomplete. A person looking at an odd old map wants either a hoax or a revelation. Shoreline change gives you neither. It gives you something much more historical. Partial truth with blurred edges. That may be the most valuable lesson here. When the sea swallows the shore, it does not only remove land, it also leaves behind a particular kind of historical temptation. We see an old map with puzzling coastal features and begin to wonder whether it records something vanished. Sometimes it does. More often, it records the messy business of people trying to keep up with a world that would not sit still long enough to be described cleanly. The Zeno Map belongs to that mess. Some of its impossibilities remain impossible. Some of its distortions become easier to understand once we remember that coasts move. And some of its lingering fascination comes from the fact that the sea is one of the few forces in history capable of making a mistaken map look almost reasonable. Which is perhaps why, after the sea has done its work and the coast no longer matches the memory, the next person in line is usually the cartographer, staring at fragments, reports, and names, and trying to turn all of it into a coherent page. That is where another part of this mystery begins, because many of the strangest lands on the Zeno Map may not be drowned truths at all, but examples of what happens when map makers inherit rumour, patch it into geography, and then pass it on, as though the ocean itself had signed off on the final draft. There is a particular kind of historical magic that happens when a rumour survives long enough to acquire latitude and longitude. At first, it is only a report. Someone heard of an island. Someone saw land through fog and never quite reached it. Someone copied a sailor's note into the margin of a manuscript. Someone else heard the story at a port where information arrives salted, delayed, translated badly, and told with the solemn confidence of a person who was definitely not inventing any part of it for dramatic effect. On its own, a rumour remains what it is, unstable, movable, deniable. But place it on a map, surround it with coastlines, give it a name that looks old enough to deserve respect, and suddenly the rumour changes status. It no longer feels like hearsay. It feels like geography. That is one of the quietest but most powerful tricks in the history of cartography. We often imagine maps as the tools that defeated uncertainty, as though map makers were engaged in a straightforward campaign against ignorance and blank space. In some cases, they were. But early maps also had another habit. They did not merely record what people knew. They organised what people half knew, misheard, guessed, inherited, preferred, feared, and hoped. The history of cartography notes that early modern maps were shaped by sources and variants of diverse origin, and that maps in this period could mix observation and fantasy, producing spaces that were not merely transcribed from the world, but actively created through style, rhetoric, and inherited material. That is an especially useful reminder with the Zeno Map, because one of the reasons it continues to feel so uncanny is that it behaves less like a clean record and more like a machine for turning uncertainty into surface confidence. The process is easier to understand if we stop imagining the map maker as a lone expert standing over measured reality, and instead picture something much messier. A Renaissance cartographer was often part compiler, part editor, part designer, part diplomat, and part gambler. He worked with travel accounts, letters, earlier maps, printed books, oral reports, classical authorities, religious assumptions, political agendas, and whatever fragments of local or regional knowledge could be obtained. Some of these sources agreed, many did not. Some were first-hand, many were not. Some were trustworthy in one region and deeply unreliable in another. A map therefore emerged not simply from observation but from negotiation. The cartographer had to decide which reports to trust, which names to preserve, which coastlines to smooth, which spaces to leave blank, and which uncertainties to convert into something more solid-looking than they really were. That last decision is where rumour becomes especially dangerous. A blank space is honest but unsatisfying. It announces ignorance too plainly. A named island, by contrast, does something psychologically reassuring even before it is proven. It implies contact, memory, and order. It tells the viewer that someone, somewhere, knew enough to call this place by something. In the case of early modern Europe, that was often enough to keep a dubious feature alive. If a map supplied a name and no later authority confidently removed it, the feature could remain in circulation for decades or even centuries. The Library of Congress notes exactly this in the case of Friesland, explaining that the Phantom Island was commonly shown on 16th and 17th century maps because cartographers believed it was real. That is the essential mechanism in miniature. Belief did not follow proof. Proof was often replaced by repetition. And repetition has an extraordinary legitimizing power. Once an island appears on one respected map, the next cartographer faces a choice. Remove it and risk omitting something other experts accept, or keep it and preserve consensus. In periods when first-hand verification was difficult, expensive, or dangerous, keeping it was often the safer professional choice. A mistake copied by one cartographer is an error. A mistake copied by 5 becomes tradition. A mistake copied by Mercator or Ortelius begins to look uncannily like fact. That is one reason the Zeno tradition became so influential. Its false or dubious features did not remain isolated. They entered a network of copying in which inherited authority could outweigh direct knowledge. This copying was not necessarily lazy, and that is worth stressing. Early modern map makers were not fools sitting around cheerfully adding non-existent islands because they found them decorative. They were operating under real constraints. Long-distance travel reports were slow. Local surveys were patchy. Coordinates were not always reliable. Coastal sightings could be affected by weather, current, visibility, sea ice, and the utterly normal human tendency to think one has understood a coast after only briefly surviving it. A mapmaker looking at 2 or 3 contradictory northern sources might reasonably conclude that preserving all plausible information was better than discarding something that could later prove valuable. In that sense, many phantom geographies began not in absurdity but in caution. It was safer to leave a doubtful island on the page than to erase a real one prematurely. That caution, however, interacted with something less innocent: rhetoric. Maps persuade. The history of cartography. Chapter on early modern literature and cartography explicitly emphasizes that maps and texts of the period shared forms of graphic rhetoric and could mix, distort, and extend inherited genres. In other words, maps did not just store information, they also shaped how a world should be imagined. A map crowded with names and coastlines appears more knowledgeable than one full of gaps. A chart that extends familiar control into uncertain waters flatters the audience. It tells patrons, readers, rulers, and merchants that the unknown is becoming manageable. That rhetorical pressure encourages completion. If the world can be represented as coherent, then it becomes easier to govern, claim, fund, narrate, and believe. This is one reason rumour enters cartography so smoothly. A rumour does not arrive dressed as fiction. It arrives as a problem of placement. The island may be there, the landfall may have been this one, The coast may have been seen in poor light. The local name may have sounded like that. The mapmaker is not always choosing between truth and invention. He is often choosing among several partial possibilities, none of them fully secure. Once he fixes one in print, though, the ambiguity collapses visually. The reader does not see the debate. The reader sees the island, and the island, once printed, begins doing work. It can be used in navigation. It can shape exploration plans. It can enter diplomacy, trade, or imperial imagination. It can anchor stories that would otherwise feel unsteady. The result is that rumour does not merely become geography on paper. It begins feeding back into real geographical action. The Zeno Map is a nearly perfect case of this process. Features like Frisland, Estotiland and Drogeo were not simply odd names for collectors to admire. They provided a structure through which later readers imagined the North Atlantic and the lands beyond it. The falsehood became operational. It changed what others thought they might find. There is also a practical reason rumours proved especially adhesive in maritime spaces. Oceans are generous to ambiguity. A mountain seen at a distance, a cloud bank mistaken for coast, broken islands merged by memory into one larger mass, currents shifting reckoning. A captain's report abbreviated by someone who did not know the language well. A place name written down by a clerk with only the roughest sense of pronunciation. All of this is enough to produce enduring cartographic residue. The sea does not hand over evidence tidily. It provides glimpses. Then a cartographer, often far from the coast in question, has to decide what those glimpses meant. That distance between observer and compiler is crucial. Many early maps were not made by people who had personally seen the places they drew. The history of cartography notes that the writer and mapmaker in this period both worked from inherited sources as well as experience, producing worlds through a blend of method, verisimilitude, and imagination. A map could therefore acquire elements that were methodical without being accurate, orderly without being true. This is exactly how rumour hardens. It is not enough for someone to say, "I heard there may be land there." That would remain unstable. What matters is when a mapmaker takes that unstable report, integrates it into a broader visual order, and gives it the appearance of having always belonged. Something similar happens with names. A name on an old map looks authoritative because names usually imply prior contact, but names are among the most vulnerable parts of geographical transmission. They drift through translation, spelling variation, local usage, mishearing, political relabeling, and simple copying mistakes. A cartographer who receives a northern place name in several forms may attach it to the wrong coast, and still feel he has preserved something essential. Later mapmakers then preserve the misplacement, because the name itself looks old, and therefore worth respecting. Soon, the misplaced name becomes a new geographical object. A rumour about a place turns into a place because the name survives more robustly than the original context. This is why some of the strangest lands on the Zeno Map feel half plausible. They may not be invented out of whole cloth. They may be compounded from old names, genuine reports, copied outlines, and wishful arrangement. The final product is not a transparent lie, but a cartographic sediment, layers of uncertainty compressed into a single printed face. That kind of geography is especially persuasive because each layer contains some trace of reality. A later viewer may sense that trace and assume the whole thing must therefore be recoverable. But historical composite objects are often cruel like that. They preserve just enough truth to make disentangling the falsehood much harder. Another force at work is prestige. Maps do not circulate in a social vacuum. A chart attached to an old family archive, a respected city, or a distinguished publisher arrives with borrowed authority. The Zeno publication was especially effective because it offered all three. It claimed noble Venetian ancestry, provided letters as narrative support, and presented the map as recovered rather than newly concocted. That framing matters because it changes how rumour is received. A sailor's tavern story is one thing. A family document from a noble lineage, printed in Venice and presented as long-neglected evidence, is quite another. the rumour is no longer naked. It has been dressed for court, and once dressed, it can advance remarkably far. The Library of Congress material on Freeland notes the island's prolonged cartographic life. The broader lesson is that maps can accumulate trust even while preserving unresolved doubts. Readers usually do not inspect a map feature by feature as a forensic exercise. They absorb the overall impression of competence. If much of the chart appears plausible, the doubtful parts benefit from proximity. A reasonably drawn Iceland helps shelter a false Freeland. A recognisable Greenland gives cover to Western names no one can securely identify. In effect, correct geography acts as ballast for rumour. One might ask why cartographers did not simply label uncertain features as doubtful and be done with it. Sometimes they did. Marginal notes, speculative captions and explanatory texts were common in certain genres, but uncertainty is not evenly distributed by printing. A doubtful note can be overlooked. A clean coastline cannot. Once engraved, the visual statement tends to dominate the caveat, and there were professional incentives to prefer coherent image over confessed uncertainty. Patrons wanted useful maps. Readers wanted complete worlds. Publishers wanted attractive, information-rich works. Even scholars often preferred a debatable answer to a blank admission of ignorance. Under those pressures, rumour did not need to conquer cartography. Cartography invited it in and gave it a chair. There is a more subtle point too. Rumour often enters maps not because cartographers are careless, but because they are trying to reconcile contradiction. Suppose one respected source places an island in one location, another source describes a coast nearby, and a travel narrative mentions a harbour that sounds as though it must belong to one of them. The mapmaker may blend the reports into a composite feature that satisfies all three imperfectly. From his perspective, he is not inventing, he is harmonising. From our perspective, centuries later, the result can look bizarre. But bizarre is often what harmonised uncertainty looks like after the original context has been lost. This is one reason old maps should be read almost like edited anthologies rather than photographs. They gather voices. Some voices are first-hand, some are inherited, some are politicised, some are simply loud. The mapmaker arranges them on the page in a way that gives an impression of unity. The more elegant the arrangement, the easier it becomes to forget how unstable the ingredients were. With the Zeno Map, that unity is especially deceptive because the accompanying narrative encourages the reader to believe all the pieces stem from one voyage tradition. In reality, the map appears to draw on mixed sources and cartographic traditions. The single voice we seem to hear is, more likely, a chorus made to sound like family memory. And once a rumour has become geography, undoing it can be unexpectedly hard. One does not merely erase a line. One has to challenge the chain of authorities that repeated it, the voyages that relied on it, the atlases that reproduced it, and the habits of imagination built around it. This is why Phantom Islands lasted so long. Their survival was not proof of reality, but of institutional momentum. A feature on a map gains durability from every later document that treats it as inherited knowledge rather than as a fresh question. All of this makes the Zeno case less mysterious in one sense and more interesting in another. The map is not strange because rumour entered it. Rumour entered many maps. It is strange because the transformation was so successful. It gathered phantom islands, uncertain names, borrowed outlines, and prestige rhetoric into a document persuasive enough to shape later cartography. That is a different kind of achievement from discovery, but it is an achievement all the same, if a slightly troublesome one. The map discovered, not lands, but the extraordinary power of print to make uncertainty look settled. So when we ask how cartographers turn rumour into geography, the answer is not by one dramatic act of deception. It is usually quieter than that. They inherit partial sources. They prefer coherence to blankness. They borrow authority from older maps and trusted names. They regularise contradictory reports into cleaner forms. They preserve doubtful features because omission feels riskier than repetition. They allow rhetoric, prestige, and expectation to fill the spaces measurement has not yet secured. Then the engraved plate does the rest. What began as hearsay becomes a coastline. What began as a possibility becomes a harbour. What began as a question becomes an island with towns. And once that island sits there long enough, the next generation may stop asking how it got there and start asking what happened to it. That is when the old uncertainty acquires a new afterlife. Because later readers, seeing the map through the lens of vanished worlds rather than rumour, begin to wonder whether these impossible lands were really errors at all, or whether beneath the copying, the distortions, and the confident naming there might still be fragments of landscapes and coastlines that changed so much that the map now looks more wrong than it once was. By the time we reach this point in the story, the easiest positions have already fallen away. It is no longer very satisfying to say that the Zeno Map is simply a hoax, and therefore nothing on it deserves a second glance. That leaves too much out. It leaves out the way real northern geography could be difficult, changeable, and only partly known. It leaves out the fact that inherited reports can preserve fragments of truth in damaged form. It leaves out the cartographic habit of turning rumour into something that looks more stable than it ever was. But the opposite position is no better. It is not enough to point at every strange island or distorted coast and announce that the map must therefore preserve a lost world, a forgotten civilization, or some impossible knowledge that mainstream history was too timid to accept. That is usually just another kind of simplification, and old maps rarely deserve simple treatment. What the Zeno Map really seems to preserve is something more awkward and more historical than either full dismissal or full revelation. It preserves the uneasy border between lost worlds and misread worlds. Some places genuinely vanish in the sense that coastlines shift, shore meadows drown, fishing stations disappear, settlements empty, names fall out of use, and landscapes that once made sense to local people become difficult for later outsiders to identify. Other places do not vanish at all. They are merely misunderstood, copied badly, doubled, moved, or wrapped in enough narrative fog that the map begins to look as though it is showing a changed Earth, when it may only be showing a confused page. The challenge is that those two possibilities often sit right on top of each other. That overlap is one of the reasons old maps can feel so much more suggestive than old texts. A text may tell you plainly that someone heard of a distant land. A map seems to make a stronger claim. It gives shape. It gives location. It supplies the visual confidence that writing can avoid. But maps are not neutral snapshots. They are edited objects. They collect assumptions, patch together sources, and make decisions on behalf of the reader. The Zeno Map does this so visibly that it almost becomes a lesson in how historical misunderstanding takes graphic form. It is filled with features that look as though they ought to correspond to something stable, and yet when you lean closer, the stability begins to dissolve. That is not necessarily because the world itself was once wholly different in some dramatic sense. More often it is because the route from world to map was crooked. Still, it would be a mistake to flatten everything into pure cartographic error. Lost landscapes are real. They do not need to be mythical to matter. Historic England's work on Dunwich shows how a once major medieval town on the Suffolk coast was steadily destroyed by erosion and storms, leaving much of the old urban fabric underwater today. This is not speculative. It is documented coastal loss, a reminder that places with streets, churches, trade and civic identity can become marine archaeology over time. If something similar were known later only through partial references and distorted mapping, it might easily acquire the air of legend. A vanished shoreline can make later readers overdramatic, but the coastline does not need our help to be ruthless. The same broader lesson appears in low-lying and storm-prone regions of northwestern Europe. Rijkswaterstaat's historical overview of Dutch water management describes centuries of interaction among sea level rise, storm surges, peat subsidence, human intervention, and changing coastlines. In landscapes like that, there is nothing fanciful about a coast having an older version and a later version. the land itself can be rearranged enough that inherited place descriptions lose their anchor. A monastery once near a tidal channel may later be farther inland or gone. A harbour may become unusable, a settlement may shift. A patch of drowned or reclaimed ground may make an old route seem nonsensical to later readers. Again, that does not make every puzzling map feature secretly accurate. It simply reminds us that the map is wrong, and the landscape changed are not mutually exclusive explanations. In Greenland, as we have already seen, the problem becomes colder and more complicated. Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland material notes ongoing late Holocene sea level change in southern Greenland, with marine transgression continuing through the Norse period and beyond, potentially reducing low-lying fertile land. Combined with increasing wind and sea ice pressures toward the Little Ice Age, that means parts of the lived coastal world of Norse Greenland were not preserved intact for later observers. A map that inherited memories from those communities, however indirectly, would not be inheriting a static stage set. It would be inheriting a world in motion. This is where the distinction between lost worlds and misread worlds becomes useful. A lost world is not necessarily an Atlantis. It can be a coastal environment whose practical form changed enough that later people no longer meet it in the same way. A misread world, by contrast, is one where the place remains but the interpretation drifts. The Zeno Map likely contains both conditions in different proportions. Some of its strange features may reflect the afterimage of real northern environments, known under different sea ice conditions, different naming systems, or through older settlement traditions. Other features are much better explained as copied mistakes, amplified rumours, or composite inventions born from the ordinary pressures of Renaissance cartography. One reason the two get confused so easily is that they produce similar feelings in the viewer. Both lost and misread worlds create distance. In each case, a name on an old map fails to align cleanly with the geography we know. The map says one thing, the modern atlas another. That gap invites narrative. Perhaps the coastline changed. Perhaps the island sank. Perhaps the old name referred to a broader region. Perhaps several islands were merged into one. Perhaps the mapmaker preserved forgotten knowledge. Perhaps the mapmaker simply guessed. All of these become available the moment a line on paper no longer lands where we expect. The emotional experience is the same even when the causes are very different. That is why so many historical map mysteries slide so quickly from sensible uncertainty into extravagant certainty. It helps then to think about scale. Truly vanished landscapes tend to become more plausible the smaller and more local they are. Low coastal meadows, sand barriers, tidal islands, shallow harbours, grazing margins, fish stations and vulnerable ports can change, flood, erode, or become inaccessible over historical time. Large mountainous islands generally do not go missing without leaving a rather significant argument behind. This is one reason Frisland remains such a useful test case. It was too large, too confident, and too cartographically developed to be rescued by modest shoreline change. The Library of Congress is direct on this point. Frisland never existed, even though it was widely copied on later maps. That is a misread world, not a lost one. It is a place made by cartographic confidence rather than geology. But once you move away from a feature like Frisland and toward places where the map seems to be borrowing, warping, or renaming real coasts, the picture becomes less stark. A misread coast can preserve traces of a vanished landscape in exactly the same way a mistranscribed word can preserve traces of a lost pronunciation. The result is neither wholly right nor wholly wrong. It is layered. Suppose a 16th century compiler inherited an older northern report describing a usable coastal margin that had since narrowed under transgression or become harder to access because of changing ice. Suppose too that the report had already passed through one or two rounds of name shifting and copying. The final map might look absurdly distorted to us, while still containing an afterimage of a real landscape no longer encountered in that older form. That is not secret mastery, it is historical lag. There is a broader geological backdrop to all this as well. Sea level histories in Europe and the North Atlantic remind us that the coastlines we treat as normal are themselves late arrangements. The US EPA's sea level summary gives the large-scale context, noting rapid post-glacial rise followed by slower but ongoing change over the last several thousand years, with local relative sea level varying depending on uplift and subsidence. Even though the Zeno Map belongs to a relatively recent slice of that history, the underlying lesson remains. Coasts do not stand still long enough to justify our confidence in them. The famous case of Doggerland makes this vivid in prehistory. University reports describing Doggerland presented as a Mesolithic landscape in what is now the North Sea, gradually inundated by rising post-glacial waters. That drowned world lies far earlier than our map, of course, but it has been culturally useful because it reminds modern audiences that submerged landscapes are not fantasy by default. Entire lived environments can disappear beneath later seas. The danger is that once people absorb that lesson, they sometimes begin applying it indiscriminately to much younger and much flimsier cartographic puzzles. The existence of real drowned landscapes does not entitle every odd island on a Renaissance map to become a survivor of geological catastrophe. It simply teaches caution in the other direction. We should not assume modern coastlines are the timeless baseline against which all earlier mapping must be judged. That caution becomes especially important when discussing the Western names on the Zeno Map, places like Estotiland and Drogeo. These have often attracted claims that the map must preserve a memory of North America or adjacent lands before they were properly integrated into mainstream European geography. The Rare Maps essay notes that some later readers indeed treated Estotiland as Newfoundland and Drogeo as part of North America, while many scholars regarded the whole business as an example of fancy and folly in early travel and mapping. That tension is instructive. A misread world can easily be reinterpreted as a lost one when enough of the vocabulary seems promising. A place name that does not fit present geography starts looking like a clue to something submerged, forgotten or suppressed, when in fact it may simply be the residue of garbled transmission. And yet there is still a reason not to be too smug about the garbling. The North Atlantic was full of partially connected knowledge systems. Norse traditions, Icelandic memories, continental cartography, fishing knowledge, local naming practices and later printed atlases did not all line up neatly. The younger Niccolo Zeno's publication was highly likely a late construction drawing on mixed sources, but mixed sources are exactly where half-remembered geography tends to survive. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography states that the map depended on Olaus Magnus and the northern mapping tradition associated with Claudius Clavus, rather than being a faithful medieval original. That is devastating if someone wants direct proof of a 14th century master chart, but it also means the map belongs to a chain of transmission in which older northern knowledge, however distorted, could still be present as residue. Residue is not proof. It is more troublesome than that. It is the kind of thing that keeps a bad document from becoming a dead document. Perhaps the best way to think about the Zeno Map, then, is as a site of compression. It compresses changing coasts, old names, copied errors, family ambition, northern environmental difficulty, and the rhetorical habits of Renaissance mapping into one visual object. No single feature has to bear the whole burden. Freyland can remain phantom. Greenland can remain real but historically difficult. Western names can remain suggestive but unstable. The result is not a map of a vanished world in the romantic sense. It is a map made from pieces of worlds that did not all exist at the same moment or in the same degree of clarity. That is also why the document continues to fascinate people who are not generally cartographic specialists. It addresses a broader human discomfort. We like the past to be settled. We like maps to improve over time in a clean line from ignorance to knowledge. We like to imagine that once a place is properly found, named and measured, it remains safely inside the archive. The Zeno Map quietly undermines that confidence. It suggests, whether truthfully or not, that places can fall out of alignment with our categories. A coastline can be real and wrong on paper. A name can survive after the referent changes. A false island can acquire generations of practical influence. A vanished landscape can make later accuracy look arrogant. A composite document can continue to preserve genuine traces without becoming trustworthy overall. There is a curious humility in that, if one lets it be. Historical geography is not simply the recovery of what was always there. It is also the study of how people failed, partially succeeded, and sometimes accidentally preserved what they did not understand. The Zeno Map belongs to that second history as much as to the first. It tells us less about an impossible hidden world than about the fragile conditions under which worlds become legible at all. A world must be seen, named, remembered, copied, and correctly placed. Lose any one of those steps and the place begins to drift. Sometimes it drifts into oblivion. Sometimes it drifts into fantasy. Sometimes it drifts into an old map and waits there, looking half familiar and half impossible, until later readers begin the whole argument again. So when we speak of lost worlds, misread worlds, and vanished landscapes in relation to the Zeno Map, we are not really choosing among three separate categories. We are describing three ways a place can become difficult to recognise. A lost world has changed physically. A misread world has changed interpretively. A vanished landscape may survive only in partial traces, names, or coastal habits. Old maps can contain all three at once, which is why they so often seem wiser than they are, and more foolish than they deserve. And perhaps that brings us as close as we are likely to get to the real force of this map. It is not compelling because it proves the impossible. It is compelling because it sits on the fault line between memory and measurement. It preserves enough northern reality to keep fantasy from fully taking over, and enough distortion to keep certainty from settling in. It offers not a hidden master map of lands that no longer exist, but something more believable and more unsettling. Fragments of places, names, and coastlines passing through time unevenly, some changing in the world, some changing on the page, until the two changes become hard to separate. Which is why there is one final step left in the journey. Once you have looked at the brothers, the forged or reconstructed chart, the phantom islands, the shifting coasts, the possibility of forgotten routes, and the cartographic habit of turning rumour into land, you are left with the larger question the Zeno Map still poses after all these centuries. Not whether it is simply true or false, but what exactly it still manages to whisper to us from the edge of all that uncertainty, and why a document so compromised remains so difficult to forget. After all the arguments, all the copied coastlines, all the vanished names, all the attempts to rescue phantom islands or expose them, what remains most striking about the Zeno Map is not that it solves anything, it is that it keeps just enough of the world inside it to remain troublesome. A completely absurd map usually becomes decorative. You glance at the sea monsters, enjoy the confidence of a non-existent kingdom, and move on. A perfectly accurate map becomes useful and then, in time, ordinary. But a map like this occupies a far more durable position. It is wrong in ways that matter, suggestive in ways that refuse to settle, and attached to a story ambitious enough to survive repeated embarrassment. That is a powerful combination. It means the map does not sit quietly in the archive. It continues to ask something of whoever looks at it. Part of what it asks is whether we really believe history improves in a straight line. We like to imagine that the past is a ladder of corrections, one generation's mistake neatly removed by the next generation's measurement, until at last we arrive at the clean authority of the modern atlas. The Zeno Map does not entirely permit that story. It reminds us that knowledge can move sideways as well as forward. It can be inherited in fragments, amplified by prestige, bent by family ambition, and preserved through error. A false island can influence real voyages. A dubious chart can shape serious scholarship for generations. A likely fabrication can still preserve pieces of older northern traditions because the fabricator was not working from nothing. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography states that the Zeno material was a fabrication, and that the map depended on Olaus Magnus and the Claudius Clavus tradition rather than surviving as a true 14th century original, but that verdict, decisive as it is, does not make the map historically empty. It makes it historically layered. And perhaps that is the first thing the map still whispers. Not that it contains hidden, forbidden truth, but that even bad documents can carry real history inside them. Not the history they claim to carry necessarily. Often something messier. In this case, the Zeno Map preserves the ambitions of 16th century Venice, the prestige logic of noble family archives, the authority of print, the uncertainty of northern geography, and the extraordinary willingness of learned Europe to let a rumour become a coastline if the rumour arrived dressed well enough. The Osher Map Library's summary is very clear that the publication elevated both the Zeno family and Venice, and that later scholarship exposed the map as compiled from earlier cartographic material rather than recovered intact from the 14th century. But that only sharpens the deeper interest. Once you know the map is composite, every feature becomes a question about transmission rather than simple discovery. That in turn leads to a second whisper, one about memory. The map suggests that places do not disappear in only one way. Some truly change. Shorelines narrow, low ground drowns, harbours silt, sea ice shifts, settlements vanish, and names fall out of use. Other places remain physically present but become difficult to recognise because the chain of naming and describing them has frayed. Greenland is still Greenland, yet the Greenland available to Norse settlers, medieval reports, Renaissance mapmakers, and modern readers is not the same object in any practical sense. Geological survey of Denmark and Greenland material notes continuing late Holocene sea level rise in southern Greenland through the Norse era and beyond, with implications for low-lying coastal land and settlement pressures. That does not make the Zeno Map a secret environmental archive of perfect accuracy, but it does remind us that a real place can alter enough over time to make old descriptions feel uncannily wrong rather than simply foolish. The same is true in a wider coastal sense. Historic England's work on Dunwich describes how a major medieval port was progressively destroyed by erosion and storms until much of the town lay underwater. If a place like that were known later only through partial records and inherited maps, one can see how quickly firm geography would begin to blur into historical unease. A coastline need not perform a theatrical disappearance to become difficult for later generations to place correctly. Sometimes it simply changes steadily enough that memory becomes the less reliable shoreline. The Zeno Map gains much of its force from living in that space between physical change and cartographic misunderstanding. Still, the map is not compelling only because some landscapes change. Plenty of coastlines have moved without becoming famous. The Zeno Map is compelling because it sits right at the point where changing landscapes meet changing authority. A coastline erodes, a report is copied, a place name shifts, a mapmaker harmonises contradictory sources, a noble descendant publishes the result as family recovery, a respected cartographer repeats it. Then a generation later, someone looking at the map no longer sees the sequence of accidents and ambitions. They see geography. This is why Phantom Islands are so revealing. Freeland never existed, and the Library of Congress says so plainly, yet it remained on important maps for a very long time, because repetition supplied legitimacy. The island acquired an afterlife not from geology but from trust. There is something almost uncomfortably modern in that. We often flatter ourselves into thinking that we are too sophisticated to let confident presentation stand in for uncertain evidence. Then an old map like this appears and reminds us that humans have always been vulnerable to the same arrangement of cues: a good story, a damaged original, a respected lineage, a plausible setting, a detailed image, a few recognisable truths to stabilise the stranger parts, and suddenly doubt becomes socially awkward. The Zeno Map still whispers that authority is often a matter of format before it becomes a matter of proof. Put something in print with enough composure, and later generations may inherit your confidence before they inherit your evidence. And that is where the map becomes larger than its own particulars. It is not only a document about the North Atlantic, it is a document about how human beings construct reality from incomplete information. The history of cartography emphasises that early modern maps could mix observation and fantasy, and that map makers were engaged not merely in reporting space, but in creating persuasive representations of it. That point matters because it rescues us from the childish habit of treating old maps as either charming mistakes or secret revelations. They were often neither. They were arguments. They were edited visions of the world, shaped by available data, inherited texts, political incentives, and aesthetic pressure. The Zeno Map is one of the clearest examples precisely because the argument is still visible through the seams. What it whispers across the centuries, then, is partly methodological. It tells us to be wary of neat categories. True and false are useful labels, but many historical objects spend their lives between them. The Zeno Map is false in its claim to be a transparent 14th century witness. It is false in its phantom geographies, above all Friesland. Yet it is true in other senses. It truly influenced later cartography. It truly shaped expectations. It truly gathered earlier northern material into a new composition. It truly reflects a Europe still uncertain enough about the far North Atlantic that distortion could pass as restoration. And it may well preserve garbled residues of real northern names, routes, and environmental difficulty, even if it cannot be trusted to place them faithfully. To say that the map is false and stop there is a bit like saying a legend is unhistorical, because the details are embellished. One may miss the far more revealing question of why this particular embellishment was persuasive in the first place. There is also a more philosophical whisper in it, and perhaps this is the one that keeps people returning who are not professional historians at all. The Zeno Map suggests that the world is never only what it is. It is also what has been remembered about it, what has been copied, what has been politically useful to claim, what has been lost from language, and what later readers are emotionally prepared to believe. A modern atlas gives us one kind of world, crisp and measured. An old map like this gives us another, not because the Earth itself was entirely different, but because the relationship between observation, memory and authority was arranged differently. The map therefore preserves not merely a geography, but an older way of being uncertain. And uncertainty is the heart of it. That may sound disappointing at first because many people come to the Zeno Map hoping for either scandalous proof or satisfying exposure. But uncertainty is often where the richest history lives. The Rare Maps essay on the Zeno tradition notes that for some readers the maps seem to point toward North America before Columbus, while for others it stood as an example of cartographic fancy. That split has never entirely gone away because the map is built from exactly the kind of material that sustains argument. Enough suggestive detail to prevent laughter from fully settling in, enough demonstrable error to keep belief from becoming secure. In a way, that unresolved quality is why the map feels older than its date. Not older in the literal sense, but older in temperament. It belongs to a world where sea routes were uncertain, where old names carried authority beyond their clarity, where the line between travel report and inherited law was not always policed as sharply as modern scholarship prefers. Even if the printed map is a 16th century creation, it still captures that older condition of partial knowledge better than many cleaner, more disciplined later charts. It feels like a map made at the edge of things, where evidence arrives cold, incomplete, and already translated once too often. That edge quality also explains why the map's errors are not merely errors. They are symptoms of where knowledge was weakest and desire was strongest. Friesland is not just a non-existent island. It is a measure of how much the period wanted the North Atlantic to be more populated with known stepping stones than it really was. The Western names are not just suspicious labels, they are measures of how much Europe wanted the ocean beyond Greenland to be narratable. Greenland's oddities are not just distortions, They are measures of how difficult a large icy coast is to hold steadily in a cartographic imagination built from fragments. In other words, the Zeno Map still whispers because every wrong feature tells us not only what was mistaken, but what kinds of certainty people were willing to manufacture to quiet their uncertainty. There is another whisper too, and it is a little more personal. The map reminds us how often we confuse detail with truth. Frisland was persuasive in part because it was detailed. The Zeno narrative was persuasive in part because it was specific. The younger Niccolo's story of damaged family papers and recovered memory was persuasive, in part because it contained exactly the kind of imperfection that makes a document seem authentic. We still live with that temptation. We still grant extra authority to what looks textured, inherited, and slightly worn. The Zeno Map is therefore not just a historical puzzle. It is a mirror held up to the way people evaluate evidence when direct verification is impossible. It tells us that one of the oldest tricks in the world is not to invent something outrageous, but to invent something almost recoverable. And perhaps that is why the map has such a strange, emotional afterlife. It does not merely tell a full story, it stages a false recovery. That is far more seductive. A false discovery announces itself too boldly. A false recovery flatters us by making us feel we are restoring neglected truth. The younger Niccolo did not say, "Here is a new map of my imagination." He said, in effect, "Here is what my family had all along, only history failed to notice." That is a powerful structure, and one that later audiences continue to find hard to resist, because it makes belief feel like justice rather than gullibility. The Osher Map Library's framing of the map as a rhetorical artifact of discovery culture fits that pattern exactly. Yet for all that, I do not think the map whispers only warning. It also whispers something gentler about historical humility. It reminds us that the past was not waiting to be tidy. People lived in partial worlds, especially at the edges of oceanic knowledge. They sailed with mixed reports, named places under difficult conditions, inherited rumours, copied what seemed plausible, and made sense of coasts that did not stand still. Even their mistakes can be surprisingly intelligent when set back into the conditions that produced them. That does not mean we should romanticize error. It means we should understand it in scale. A phantom island can coexist with genuine environmental difficulty. A forgery can coexist with inherited fragments. A wrong map can still be an honest guide to what a culture hoped the world looked like, and that may be the most durable whisper of all. The Zeno Map does not survive because it proves there were lands that no longer exist. It survives because it dramatizes the much stranger truth that places can vanish in several ways at once. A shore may change, a settlement may disappear, a name may detach from its coast, a report may be copied badly, a rumour may become an island, a family may become the guardian of an improved memory. Centuries later, all of that arrives before us in one printed sheet, and we are left trying to separate world from wording, landscape from legend, and change in nature from change in narration. That is not a failure of the map, it is its gift. It makes visible the fragile chain by which geography becomes knowledge. Most of the time that chain is hidden from us. We open an atlas, trust the coast, and get on with our day. The Zeno Map refuses to let the chain stay hidden. It shows us every weak link at once. It shows us how easily the sea, memory, prestige, copying, and ambition can work together until the result looks like fact. And once you have seen that process so clearly, it becomes difficult to look at any map, ancient or modern, with quite the same innocence again. So if the Zeno Map still whispers anything across the centuries, it is not a single revelation. It is a tone, a reminder that old documents are often less like verdicts and more like conversations overheard badly through a door. A reminder that coastlines are historical, not eternal. A reminder that names can outlive the worlds they once described. A reminder that authority is often inherited faster than doubt. And a reminder that even when a map fails to tell us exactly where a lost land was, it can still tell us something far more lasting about the human need to believe the world was known a little earlier, a little better, and a little more completely than it really was, and perhaps that is enough to leave with. Not a final answer pinned neatly to the page, but the image of an old chart spread open in dim light, full of coastlines that behave badly and names that refuse to sit still asking after all this time whether what vanished was really the land itself, or only our ability to say, with confidence, what we were looking at.